It's a delight to welcome you to our celebration and program for the opening of our new exhibition, Mystery and Faith, the Shroud of Turin. So on behalf of our board of directors, in fact, our board chair is here today, Mr. Steve Green, and our CEO, Mr. Harry Hargrave, are both here today. So this is a pretty big deal. You know that right off the top. And the rest of our staff, welcome to Museum of the Bible. This has been about a 4-year journey for us. The first idea for this exhibition came about when a good friend of the museum, Myra Adams, asked for a meeting and broached this idea. And we were originally planning to open actually a year ago. And then this thing called COVID happened. And kind of joked about this on Wednesday. If we had waited 4 more days, we wouldn't have had to worry about these. So almost perfect timing. But we're delighted to be here and thrilled with the exhibition and grateful that you have joined us today. A couple of comments. The Shroud is the first viral image. Since the 14th century, unnumbered crowds have lined up to see it. The image was reproduced innumerable times through the centuries through replicas and contact reproductions that were shown throughout churches. Again, in the late 19th century, the famous negative photographic images of Secunda Pia again went viral with its evocative, almost ghostly image of the crucified man of the Shroud. And as scientific testing methods developed in the 20th century, interest in the Shroud grew. And the Shroud became almost a pop culture sensation. It was on the cover of magazines and the topic of documentaries and even, coffee mugs. And as the global pandemic brought with it sickness and suffering and death, the Shroud was again brought out in the public and live streamed on each of the past 2 Holy Saturdays, used in the same way as it has been for centuries, to serve as a way to focus prayer and supplication for healing. The exhibition's goal is to help us explore piety and pilgrimage and the importance of physical objects in faith, the relationship between science and faith, and above all, to do what the Shroud has done for centuries, to point us to the Gospels, to Jesus Christ, who was scourged, a crown of thorns placed on his head, made to carry his own cross, who was crucified, died, and was buried. And you know the rest of the story, of course. But as the church enters the season of Lent, it provides us with another opportunity to meditate on the suffering of Jesus Christ and the healing that comes from him. As the first letter of Peter writes, echoing the prophets, quote, "When Jesus, the great shepherd, was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to the one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed." And so in the midst of these days with a terrible war and the lingering global pandemic, the Shroud points us again to these wounds that bring healing. I would like to take a few minutes to thank many people involved in this project, the events, and the exhibition itself. First, I'd like to thank our sponsors for today's event. And I think there's a slide that will come up with our sponsors, if I am doing this correctly. Great. So sponsors for today's event are EWTN Television Network. Very grateful. They had a great, wonderful spot on the museum on their news program last night. So really appreciate that. Also the Napa Institute, the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast, and Sign from God. And you'll hear more about them later on. Many of their leadership are here today, and we thank them for their support. In fact, if you are part of one of those organizations, would you please stand so we could thank you? Myra's here. I'd also like to thank members of our Catholic Advisory Board here at the museum. Lee Crisp, who serves actually also on our board of directors. Lee, could say hi. Oh, he's sitting in the back, yeah. As well as Matthew Bunson and Lisa Rowan, who I know is here somewhere. Lisa? Hiding somewhere. She's probably trying to get more people in here. And Jacqueline Halbig von Schleppenbach. I think she'll be here later on today. So thanks to our advisory board. And then I would like to take a moment because they don't, to put together an exhibition is a long process and involves many talented people here at the museum. So we'll introduce Brian Hyland, the curator for the exhibit, in a moment here, but I would like to just recognize the staff who contributed to the project. Christy Wallover, who's our exhibition developer, and fantastic job. Her job is to take Brian and make him interesting, if we can put it that way. Yeah. He's already interesting, but anyway, you get it. Kurt Martin developed many of the applications and interactors for the exhibit. Ron Eddy did the graphics and visual elements, and Rena Opert helped pull it all together as our director of exhibits. Beyond that, I'm just going to list off many people who helped. Anthony Schmidt, Chris Sarton, Danielle Whitehead, Jared Wolf, Jeff Baxter, Jim Stolito, Judy Hilofsky, Brian Murphy, Christine Manwiller, Jesse Reynolds, Joe Conrad, who is running the booth somewhere over here, Karen Poth, Katie Knox, KJ Kim, Michael Miller, Stephen Gorman, Steve O'Neill, Tom Henninger. That's 23 people to pull that exhibition together. I'd also like to thank Roto Design in Ohio, who helped with some of the physical elements in the exhibition, and 3D Photo Works and John Olson, who developed and created that wonderful interactive table of the Shroud with the touch sensors and the sensory aspects to it. So thank you to John for his excellent work on that feature of the exhibit. I'd also like to thank you all for your support of the museum, for coming here today, you're visiting the museum, becoming members, even your financial support. Thank you for your support in joining us to fulfill our mission of inviting all people to engage with the transformative power of the Bible. And one last thank you. I'd like to bring Brian over, and we have some special guests here today, which we didn't expect. Popped up, I think, on Thursday. In the exhibition is a beautiful direct replica of the Shroud of Turin that was created by Lino Falcandino in Bergamo, did I say that right? Bergamo, Italy, and donated by Enrico Simonato, who is the secretary of the, well, in English, it's the International Center for the Study of the Shroud. I'm not going to try to fake Italian. We'll just skip that. So we are honored to have here with us today a representative from Gandino, Italy, the valley where this was produced, Cristina Piccinini, and her husband, Matthew Monichi.
Good afternoon. I have a little speech from the people of Gandino for you. Dear friends, my name is Cristina Piccinini, and with my husband, Matthew, I have the honor and pride of representing the Gandino community on this important occasion. Gandino is a town of 5,600 inhabitants in the province of Bergamo, at the foot of the Alps, about 50 miles from Milan. Unfortunately, Bergamo is one of the most affected places in the world by COVID-19. Precisely in those months of the lockdown in 2020, the Lino Valgandino project was started to promote the textile activity that has seen the workers and company of Valgandino as protagonists for centuries. A field with ancient flax seeds was grown, and with the harvest, the yarn was made, according to procedure without chemical intervention. Thanks to an antique loom and a printing press with a very high resolution, we have arrived at the result you will see here today, a copy of the Shroud in 1:1 scale, very close to the original, that has been approved by the International Center for Study on the Shroud that granted it to the Museum of the Bible. The Gandino community, through me, would like to thank the Museum of the Bible for the setup created and the honor reserved for those who worked on the project. Sorry, I never do this. What unites us today and forever is mystery and faith. And we believe that a common appeal for peace among people can start from here. The world really needs it. Thanks again.
And I invite our curator, Mr. Brian Hyland, to say a few remarks about the exhibition.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to Museum of the Bible and the opening of Mystery and Faith, the Shroud of Turin. Thank you all for being here. As Jeff said, this is the culmination of years of work. I like to tell people that I've been working on this so long that I started way back in the dim mists of history, the time known as BC, before COVID. And working on this Shroud project has been incredibly rewarding. I came in with very little knowledge about it and walked out with just an overwhelming understanding of just how important this object is. And I would just like, for a show of hands, how many of you have been through the exhibit so far? Good. Then you'll know what I'm talking about. One of the things that happened in the design process, originally I was thinking of it being very linear, going from section 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. But in the process, what happened was there was a change that was made and we had an open floor plan. And right at the heart of the exhibit is the beautiful facsimile that we received from Gandino. And it's paired with a touch table made for us by 3D PhotoWorks, which allows a person who is blind or a person with limited sight to feel the surface of the shroud and to feel the image of the man of the shroud there, and to come to know what Pope John Paul II meant when he called the shroud a mirror of the gospel. As you touch that, you can encounter sensors, and these sensors are linked to recordings. There are more than 25 Bible verses from the Gospels referring to the wounds that Jesus bore for us. You can hear those. There are other sensors that talk about other aspects. The shroud has been through a lot of history and has been burned a couple of times. It's narrowly escaped being burned a third time. It's been damaged by water. And so there are all these marks on the shroud, and the other sensors will tell you what you are looking at. What you see at the heart of this exhibition is something very, very important. Jesus died a very, very brutal death, and the marks of the shroud give testimony to that. You see man's inhumanity to man written on the shroud. When Pope St. John Paul II talked about this, he said that it also should remind us of the various aspects of human brutality that still stalk this world today. But besides having these images of brutality, the image itself is an image of love. It is an image that shows God's love for each and every one of us and how he sent his son, who accepted this awful death that we might be saved. Focus on the shroud. The nice thing about the exhibit is if you go to Turin to see it, you will stand in line. You'll see it for about 90 seconds, and then you have a memory to last a lifetime. But here you can stare at that incredible facsimile. You can see how it has the same herringbone pattern weave as the original shroud. You can see the marks there, and you have time. You can sit there. There's a bench. You can sit there and stare at it. And I noticed on our opening night, people were doing exactly that. And you can see and understand and take in the message of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ for us. Enjoy today. Thank you.
Thank you. The program today is printed. Hopefully you've received a program, and I won't read the bios of each speaker. They're there, and all good friends of the museum. But our program will have 3 speakers, and then an intermission, and then an opportunity for some Q&A, both from online and from the audience here with our speakers, as well as with Dr. Cheryl White, who will be joining for that as well. And then we'll be really honored to have some remarks toward the end of the day from His Excellency Archbishop Christophe Pierre, who will be joining us later on. First speaker today is Barry Schwartz, who's, you can read his bio, but he was the official documenting photographer for the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP, which was conducted in 1978. And he has a unique story and history of interaction with the Shroud. He joins us today virtually. Okay. 55 miles up into the mountains, 55 miles from Colorado Springs, Colorado. So please welcome Barry Schwartz.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you. I'd like to, first of all, extend my great thanks to the Museum of the Bible, their staff, and all the personnel that have been involved in the creation of this superb exhibit. In my opinion, long overdue in this country, and I'm grateful for all the hard work that's been put into this to bring this to the world. So first thing I'd like to do before I get into my slideshow is I'd like to give you a quick overview of how I got involved with the Shroud of Turin Research Project. Back in 1970s, I operated a photographic studio in Santa Barbara, California, and one of the local companies hired me as a photographic consultant for one of their projects, which was with Los Alamos National Laboratories. And the gentleman that I worked with was a man named Don Devan, who was an imaging scientist. Well, after we finished that 7-month project, about a week or so afterwards, I got another call from Don Devan, thinking it might be another job. And Don Devan said, no, not exactly. He said, what do you know about the Shroud of Turin? And I laughed. I said, but Don, I'm Jewish. And Don laughed and he said, so am I, remember? And Don was one of the other Jewish members of our team, along with Dr. Alan Adler, who was our blood chemist on the team. Well, when he told me about the Shroud, he said, look, they've just done an experiment with the Shroud and noticed some new properties of the Shroud's image and verified that they were actually there. And they're putting a team together. We're going to need a photographer. Would you like to participate? And I said no. But it was the image property that he talked about and described to me in rather technical terms, so I'm not going to go into it here. It was that image property that ultimately hooked me, because I understood that that property could not be created with an artwork or even with photography. So with that in mind, I will now share my screen. Give me just a moment to do so. So with that in mind, let me begin this presentation by, first of all, giving you the goal of the STURP team. And this is important, and that's why I'm starting. And by the way, this will be one of only 2 slides where I'll make you read anything off the screen. The primary goal of the STURP team was to scientifically characterize, document, and ultimately determine what formed the image on the Shroud. And of course, the predominant theories of the day suggested it would be some kind of a painting or other form of art, or a scorch made by a hot metal statue, or that it was even produced photographically. All the experiments and tests we performed were designed specifically to answer that question. And all of our data and final conclusions were ultimately created the primary database of documented Shroud facts in the scientific literature. So anyone starting to study the Shroud today should look at that data, because it was taken directly from the Shroud. We were not trying to prove it was the burial shroud of Jesus or prove that it was the result of the resurrection. So continuing on, that test that Don Devan was telling me about took place at Sandia National Laboratories, a sister lab to Los Alamos National Labs. And at present at that test with something called a VP8 image analyzer was, of course, Don Devan, John Jackson, and Eric Jumper, the co-founders of the STIRP team, Ken Stevenson, and the gentleman at Sandia Labs that was the gentleman that had the VP8 was Bill Modern. Bill Modern was an X-radiographic expert, and he got this VP8 to help him see if he could get more detail out of the X-rays that he was basically doing for his other work at the lab. And this is the VP8 image analyzer itself, and there's one in the exhibit that you can actually see. I used to tell people this looked like an old stereo tuner, but today nobody knows what a stereo tuner is. Welcome to the digital world. What's unique about this instrument is that for many years, going all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century, Shroud scholars predicted that there was some depth or topographic information encoded in the image, but they had no way to verify that. It wasn't until they put a photograph of the Shroud of Turin into the VP8 image analyzer that they saw this, the natural relief of a human form. And what this shows that there's some correlation between the lights and darks of the image on the shroud and the distance between the cloth and the body when the image formed. So in other words, the imaging mechanism of the shroud encoded spatial or depth information into the density of the image. We photographers would love to be able to do that, but we can't. We can only imply depth with shadows and highlights. This actually encoded spatial or dimensional information into the image itself. And that's what makes this an important moment, because this is the first time that a scientific instrument was able to reveal and display that property of the shroud. And I always tell people that normal photographs won't do this. And so here's a photograph of a couple of kids. And as you can see, there's absolutely nothing natural about what the VP8 reveals on these kids. So basically it distorts the image. It'll show something, but not the natural relief of the shroud the way you see it here. So ultimately, because of this property, I did join the team, and we were working in small groups, regional groups. I was in the West Coast group at the time in California that included all the photographic team members. That also included 2 members from the Jet Propulsion Lab, Don Lynn and John Lohr. Don Lynn had been was my hero on the team because he had been head of imaging for NASA on the Voyager, Viking, Mariner, and Galileo projects. And if you're a technical photographer, a NASA imaging scientist is about as good as you can get. So we worked in these regional groups, the California group, mostly imaging guys, Colorado, New Mexico group, Los Alamos and Sandia Laboratories. The Colorado group included Jackson, Jumper, Stevenson, and several others from the Air Force Academy. And there was an East Coast group that was comprised of our medical team that included Heller and Adler and Joseph Gambasi, a medical doctor who had been studying the shroud. We finally came together as a full team 1 month before we were to go to Turin in Amsden, Connecticut for what we called the dry run. And it gave us the opportunity to test our experiments, to test out the table, as you can see in this image. This is with a replica shroud on it. The table was designed, made of steel, so we could fasten the shroud to the table using magnets at its periphery. And ultimately, that would then help prevent any possible damage to the cloth. Every test that we performed was designed to be non-destructive, that would cause no harm to the cloth in any way, shape, or form. So we finished the dry run. Everything seemed to be working well. We packaged everything up into 80 crates and shipped it over to Turin. And in Turin at that time, and here I'm going to show you, this is the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, where the shroud had been stored since 1578. In fact, 1978 was the 400th anniversary of the shroud being in Turin. And consequently, they had a public exhibition of the shroud at that time. Behind here is the dome of the Guarini Chapel, where the shroud was permanently stored when it was not on display. And the square building with the courtyard in the center is the Royal Palace. And that was where we were going to perform our examination in rooms, excuse me, in the Royal Palace. And you can see that the shroud was on public display, and we were amazed at how many people were standing in line. If you look at this little area over here, a little closer, you can see about 100,000 people standing in a queue that took sometimes as long as 10 hours for them to get to the cathedral and get that 90 seconds or so in front of the shroud before they were moved on and the next group came through. Now, the other news that was the bad news upon our arrival was Italian customs saw one of our crates had a radiation sticker on it because it contained a small X-ray machine, and consequently they seized all of our equipment and wouldn't release it to us. We arrived in Turin a week in advance so we could unpack everything, calibrate the instruments, and be ready when the shroud was brought to us. Unfortunately, the equipment was tied up in customs, so we had these 5 days of going crazy trying to get something accomplished, but we really couldn't do it without our instruments. It did give us time to go to the Museum of the Shroud, and here I'm standing next to, that's actually me, standing next to the Secondo Pia camera that he made the first photographs with, and that's a Nikon F3 around my neck, which today both are equally obsolete because they both use film. And speaking of film, I had a 10-year-old kid at one of my lectures ask me if film was a USB device. So it's getting more difficult for those of us who talk about the image on the shroud to explain it to a younger audience who are only familiar with the digital world. Now, we did get allowed into the Royal Palace so we could start cleaning and preparing the rooms where we would do our examination. So I was able to make some photographs within that. After 5.5 days, we got the word that our equipment had been released, finally. Now, I won't go into detail, but there was a lot of behind the scenes machinations going on that finally got the equipment released. And you can see here, they loaded it onto a dump truck. And this is in the courtyard of the Royal Palace. And as I'm making this photo, somebody ran up to the driver and asked him not to dump all the equipment out. And he laughed and he said, "No, of course not. You go ahead and unload the truck, please." So we had to unload the truck and bring all of our equipment up several flights of marble stairs into the rooms where we were to examine the shroud. And it was pretty stressful. We only had a day and a half left before the public exhibition was ending and we were going to get the shroud. So nobody slept for that day and a half. We just continued to work to unpack our equipment and get everything ready and bring everything, to a preparatory point where we were ready to examine the shroud. And here's Vern Miller and Ernie Brooks unpacking some of the photographic equipment that we used. And this is interesting. This is what we call the equipment maintenance room. This is where any repairs or maintenance that were needed to be done could be done. And if you look back here, this doorway leads into the room where we examine the shroud. And also notice these garden hoses. Remember, this is back in 1978 before solid state electronics, and one of our instruments required to be water cooled. And I'm standing in the doorway making this photograph. And to my left down the end of that hallway is the only operating bathroom in that section of the palace. And so we had to go out and buy a bunch of garden hoses and string them all together from that bathroom down the hallway through the equipment maintenance room and into the room in which we would examine the shroud. You can see the hoses coming in here. So this was not the laboratory setting that most people would expect us to be working in, but we had to make do with what we had. So we also had to cover the windows because some of our experiments were thermal or infrared imaging, and the sunlight shining through the cracks in the shutters would have driven those instruments crazy, so we had to cover all the windows. Here, the gentleman on the right, Don Devan, in middle, Sam Pellicore, an optical physicist on our team, part of the West Coast team, and Vernon Miller, who is head of scientific and industrial photography at Brooks Institute of Photography. And what they're doing here is they're setting up the camera support system. Remembering the shroud is over 14 feet in length, if you slide your camera along the rail, you want to keep the distance the same. So what they're doing here is measuring the distance, and then they would sandbag this into place so that once we were making the actual photographs of the shroud, for example, I photographed the shroud in 2 halves on my 4x5-inch film camera. And 20 years later, when I could digitize them and put them together in Photoshop, it was a perfect match because these guys thought to do this. And remember, everything I'm showing you here had to be planned in advance, fabricated, and then packaged and shipped to Turin. So we had to anticipate every possibility before we ever left for Turin. And of course, about an hour and a half ahead of schedule, somebody yelled, "Here comes the shroud." And I ran out into the hallway to make this singular image of them bringing the shroud out the back door of the Guarini Chapel. The Cathedral Chapel and Royal Palace are all connected, so you can go between the 3 buildings without ever going outside. And here they've just brought the shroud, taken off public display into the hallway, and they bring it down through the equipment maintenance room and into the room where the shroud was to be examined. So you notice that table in the background, our table that we were going to fasten the shroud on with magnets, and you'll notice there's something unique about it. All of a sudden, there's this gold stuff on the panels. Well, those removable panels were necessary so the X-ray guys could do their X-rays. But once we unpacked the table, we found a white powdery kind of oxidation on the surface of the steel, and we knew we could not put the shroud on that without potentially contaminating it. And they anticipated that might be a problem. And thankfully, we had 2 NASA guys with us who brought with them some of the gold foil mylar that you've seen in the cargo bay of the space shuttle or even on satellites. And we had to cover the panels of that table with that gold foil mylar. And here you see they're unveiling the shroud before us, and there's still a few panels that haven't even been covered. That's how close we were in getting ourselves prepared because of losing that 5.5 days. And this is our first look at the shroud itself. And it was pretty amazing. Now, I'm going to share a quick story with you. We were told that if we touched the shroud, the carabinieri, the state police that were in plain clothes, all armed, that were guarding the shroud, if we touched the shroud, they would shoot us. Well, of course, they weren't serious about that, but we didn't notice. So notice the American guys on the right have their hands behind their back, and the Italians are already getting ready to handle the shroud. Obviously, nobody was going to shoot anybody, but this was the care that was given and the concerns that were given. And I'm not sure if they were just teasing us or if they were serious, but at any rate, obviously, you cannot examine the shroud without touching it. And here you can see that the shroud was fastened onto a painted white board using thumbtacks. And again, you can see that a couple of the panels still haven't been covered. So obviously we had to remove the thumbtacks. And once the thumbtacks were removed, we could then transfer the shroud. And here the table has now been covered completely. And we could transfer the shroud onto our table as we had planned, and ultimately fastened it with those white magnets. And the reason those magnets are white, they're originally bar magnets, but we were concerned that particles of metal might come off of those magnets and contaminate the shroud. So all of those magnets have been coated in Teflon, an inert material that would prevent any kind of contamination to the cloth. So again, all of this had to be planned in advance, and gratefully, these guys were smart enough to think of all this before we ever went to Turin. Now, first up was Max Frey. Max was a Swiss criminalist who had pioneered the use of sticky tape on the clothing of crime scene victims. And so Max brought some, looks like dime store sticky tape, and was taking tape samples from the shroud. Unfortunately, the tape also left some of the sticky gum on the surfaces of the shroud, which over time collected some dust and had to be cleaned. We also had a tape experiment, and I'll show you a little bit about that a little later on in the presentation. Next up was Professor Rigi. He had been given 2 weeks' notice. The Americans are coming. We want you to go first. We need you to come up with something to study the shroud. Well, anyone who studied the shroud realizes that back in 1532, after the fire that created so much damage on the cloth, After that time, in 1534, the Poor Clare sisters had repaired the shroud, sewed in patches, and attached to the back of the shroud, sewed to the back of the shroud, a backing sheet or what was called the Holland cloth. And Rigi got the idea of separating in small areas the Holland cloth from the shroud. Nobody had seen the backside of the shroud in almost 450 years. So Rigi got the idea of separating the two and inserting between the two cloths a vacuum to vacuum materials, any loose materials and debris that might be there, but also an endoscopic camera system so he could see the backside of the shroud and photograph it. Now, back at our dry run in Amsden, the month before we left for Turin, we tested an endoscopic camera system and found that the fiber optic cables that historically transmit the image from the end of the device back to the camera was so coarse that the images were not going to be usable. So we opted not to use an endoscopic system in our examination of the shroud. Well, as they're making this cut here and separating the two cloths, I realized we're about to see the first look at the backside of the Shroud of Turin in nearly 450 years. And here you see that precise moment. That's Ray Rogers, John Jackson, and Professor Rigi there getting the first look at the underside of the Shroud of Turin in over 400 years. Now, this is Rigi's vacuum experiment, and you can see the vacuum there, and up in the handle were some filters, sterile filters, so he could vacuum an area, take that filter out, label it, put in a new clean filter, and do the same thing in a different area. Once he wanted to put his endoscopic camera system in, he realized that it was going to be difficult to know from exactly where he was underneath the cloth. So he had constructed a grid of 10 centimeter squares made of string that he could lay onto the shroud. And when he turned on his focusing lamp, he knew precisely exactly what he was seeing from the underside. And this also had an important moment for the STURP team, because when we saw light transmitted through the shroud, and this happens to be the 3 blood stain on the forehead, we realized that wherever something had been added to the cloth, in this case blood, that light shining through would show added density there. So Eric Jumper came running up to me and said, we're going to find 30 minutes somewhere in the next 5 days so you can photograph the entire shroud with transmitted light. And this is probably maybe the most important photograph I made in 1978. I did both ventral and dorsal. I'm only showing you the front here. Notice that you can see the blood stains at the arms, the spear wound. You can see water stains. You can see scorches and patches and holes where no patches were placed. What can't we see here? The image. And this is the first scientific evidence that we could present to you that shows that the image on the shroud is not a painting, because nothing was added to create that image. And had it been added, we would see it here, just as we do with the blood and the water stains. And so this is the evidence. And here, just as a quick reference, this is the shroud, and here it is with transmitted light. The image doesn't show because the image only lives on the top surface of the top fibrils of the cloth itself. So as you can see, that became a significant moment, and it was thanks to Rigi's experiment that the idea came for us to make that photograph. Now, rather than go through in technical detail, since time is limited here, rather than going into a lot of detail and reading all these words to you, what I'm doing here is I'm showing you the instruments that we used, and I've labeled the experiments that those instruments were responsible for. And that way I can kind of go through this quickly. You know, getting me started is easy and getting me stopped is very difficult. And I've only been given 30 minutes. So I'm doing it this way to make it easy for you and easy for me. Now, we had on our team Roger and Marty Gilbert. They were the owners and founders of the Oriel Corporation that at that moment in history made the best spectral instruments in the world. Their clients included the government, the military, and many scientific laboratories around the world. And they brought with them their finest state-of-the-art instruments circa 1978. And we can laugh about it a little bit today, because obviously today the instrument would be smaller and it would be attached to a computer. but we didn't have any computers that were viable in 1978. So you can see in the foreground here that the output of this device was to a chart recorder, not exactly what we would be doing today. And we did the x-rays. Well, this is the little devil that cost us all that trouble and lost us 5.5 days at the beginning. This is a low power x-ray device. X-rays could be harmful to the cloth, so they brought a very low power x-ray with them, x-ray device with them. And you know, typically when we go to a dentist and he does an x-ray of our jaw, it takes about 1 second to expose the x-ray, and then he goes and processes it and we can look at it. The problem we have with this is because it's such a low power x-ray, each exposure was 20 minutes long. So Bill Modern, the gentleman on the right, when he was making his x-rays, could not do the x-rays with any of us in the room because those parquet wooden floors moved around when you walked on them. Worse than that, there was traffic going routed right next to the palace in those days. They don't do that anymore. So every time a truck or a bus went by, the whole building would vibrate, which would have caused blurring of the x-rays. So he had to do all the x-rays in the middle of the night when there was little or no traffic, and we all had to leave the room. And once he started the exposure, he couldn't move his feet for 20 minutes or he could cause the x-ray to be blurred. Ultimately, you can see here one of the x-rays, and this is one of the problems we had to anticipate. Okay, we could go there and expose a bunch of x-rays, and then what? Do we bring those exposed x-rays back through the airports that are filled with x-ray machines that would cause fogging and damage to the x-rays potentially? No, that wasn't possible. So what we had to do was we had to process the x-rays on site. Well, you need two things to process x-rays. One, you need a room that could be made totally dark, and two, you need a water supply. So we had to make do with what we had. And so we had to convert the bathroom into a dark room to be able to process our films. But ultimately, that's what we did. We had no choice but to make do with the limited resources that we had available to us. And some people laugh when I show this photograph, but hey, we had to do it. We had to get those x-rays processed. To me, the brilliance of it all is they anticipated these possibilities and had everything with us. You know, when you're in Turin and you forgot something in New Mexico, you can't run home and get it. And so we had to anticipate every potential problem. We also did photomicroscopy. That's photographs through a microscope. And this particular instrument was loaned to us by the manufacturer. So we were he was very kind. I believe they were either a German or a Swiss company. And that's Mark Evans, who was a graduate student at Brooks, who Vern Miller brought onto the team because he was an expert with a microscope. And this is one of the many photomicrographs that Mark created during our examination. Again, you can find these online. Some of these images are online, some on shroud.com, some on Shroud Scope. And you can go find those but just by searching online. We also did ultraviolet fluorescence photography, and that's Vern Miller and Don Devan again, doing some of the photographs of the Shroud. Now, UV fluorescence photography is a little different. You put a filter over your light sources and a special filter over your lens. And when you expose the film, the only thing that is being exposed onto the film is the fluorescence of the object that you're shooting. One of the theories was that the Shroud was a scorched image from a hot statue. So we needed to do the UV fluorescence. We found that all the documented scorches on the Shroud fluoresced in the red. The background of the Shroud fluoresced in a kind of a yellow-green, and the image on the Shroud showed no fluorescence and actually quenched the fluorescence of the background, eliminating high temperature as a mechanism for creating the image. The other thing UV does is it reveals things that the human eye might not be able to see. And so here you can see the spear wound bloodstain. You can see the shape of the oval shape of the wound, and surrounding it is a serum halo. You know, the particulate matter of the blood gets onto the cloth, but the serum, the liquid portion, spreads out via capillarity, and you can only see this serum stain or serum halo by UV fluorescence photography. So this was something new that was revealed, but that's the reason we brought these tests with us. remember, our focus was on the image and what we could see there. You've already seen the transmitted light photographs that I made, and you can see me there with my larger 4x5-inch camera. But I was also responsible for documenting every spot that all the other researchers took their data from. And since we were already using magnets, I gave these magnets to each of the researchers. They would put them in place. Once they were in place, I rephotographed them and created a set of maps that you can find on shroud.com. I'm not going to go into detail. Interestingly enough, it took me a few months to create the 8 maps that I did. Today in Photoshop with digital technology, I could probably do it in 2 or 3 days. So the technology was one of our great benefits at the time, but also one of our limits. As I said, Ray Rogers also used a sticky tape experiment. He went to 3M and had them create a tape that would leave no sticky gum residue on the surface of the shroud. And the base of the tape, the mylar base of the tape, had optical properties that would allow for polarized light microscopy directly on those tapes. He also understood that if you took the tapes off the shroud and stuck them onto a glass slide, anything embedded in the gum would get pressed deeper into the gum, making it harder to access. So he designed this well slide where the tapes are only touching at the edges and there's a few millimeters below the surface of the gum so that nothing would get pressed into the gum. We also had a computer. The computer never worked. What's funny about it is you couldn't go and buy a computer like this. The gentleman, Bob Ewing there, had to build this computer. And below it is a floppy disk drive, no hard drives at the time. And that's an 8-inch floppy. And unfortunately, in the 5 days and nights we were there, the only thing Bob Ewing could get it to do was this. Now, whether or not he had other experiments planned, I'll never know because the computer never worked. So with that in mind, let's go to the conclusions. I told you there were only going to be 2 slides with a bunch of words on them, but this is an important one. The answer to the question of how the image was produced or what produced the image remains now, as in the past, a mystery. Remember, we had gone there with one purpose, to answer the question, how is the image formed? And we could come back, and we came back with data that told us what it's not. We proved it's not a photograph. We proved it's not a scorch, and we proved it's not an artwork or painting of any kind. But we don't know of a mechanism that can create an image with these chemical and physical properties. So, as it says, we can conclude for now that the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It's not the product of an artist. The blood stains are composed of hemoglobin and also give a positive test for serum albumin. Now, Father Spitzer is going to talk a little more about the blood, so I'll just leave it at this. The image is an ongoing mystery, and until further chemical studies are made, perhaps by this group of scientists or perhaps by some scientists in the future, the problem remains unsolved. I will say this, that we came back with the data to answer or try to answer that one question, but we also came back with 1,000 new questions that came from the new data we had. And so our hope was to do a second examination of the shroud and do a follow-up to either further answer the newer questions and continue our studies of the shroud. Unfortunately, STIRP 2, they tried to get it going, but eventually it was turned down, so we could never go back to answer some of those new questions that were raised. Now, I'm going to end with one more thought, since this is the Museum of the Bible. Being Jewish, I've had quite an experience in working with all the folks, both in Rome and in Turin and around the US and around the world. I've probably attended more Catholic masses than some of my Catholic friends. And so faith has always been an issue with the shroud. And that's something that, although the STIRP team was focused on the science, I don't think it was lost on any of us that faith was an issue. And I'll tell you that after all these years, I've come to understand that the answer to faith is not on the shroud itself, but in the eyes and hearts of those who look upon it. So I think it's incumbent on each person to study the shroud, to examine the shroud, to look at it and decide for himself what it might mean. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barry. Russ Brialt he's the president and founder of the Shroud of Turin Education Project, a member of the Shroud Science Group, frequent presenter, and soon to be YouTube star, right, Russ? You did a YouTube video last week, and when is that going to come out? Oh, so it's already viral. Awesome. Great. Okay. Fantastic. Well, great. First week of March. All right. Well, please welcome Russ Brialt.
All right. For some reason, I always have to lower the microphone. So now, thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you, Brian. Thank you for everyone involved in this magnificent exhibit. And thank you all for coming. And it's indeed a great privilege and honor for me to be here. And now let's see, this is I am Russ Brialt from Atlanta, Georgia. And I brand everything Shroud Encounter. So I run around doing all over the country doing Shroud Encounters, and that's even the name of my website is shroudencounter.com. And so let's see if this is going to work. Oh, the clicker works. Now I'm going to have to probably do a lot of looking up here to see what's on the screen. But I have to start here. And Father Spitzer, I'm starting with John chapter 20, verses 1-9. So I don't know if you were planning to go there, but I always have to start here. And it says, early Sunday morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that the stone was rolled aside from the entrance. She ran and found Simon Peter and me and said, they have taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and I don't know where they've put him. So now Mary goes to the tomb first. She doesn't go inside the tomb. She just peeks in there and sees that the body's gone. And her first reaction is that someone has taken the body. So she goes to find the apostles. And then it says this, we, meaning Peter and John, we ran to the tomb to see. I outran Peter and got there first and stooped and looked in and saw the linen clothes lying there, but I did not go in. Then Simon Peter arrived and went on inside. He also noticed the clothes lying there. And then I went in too and saw and believed. Believed what? Well, believed that he had risen, or at least believed that something extraordinary had occurred. Now, interesting, it begs the question, doesn't it? What did Peter and John see that Mary didn't see? Mary didn't go inside that tomb. Peter and John run back down. They stoop down. They go inside the tomb, see the linen cloth lying there, and believe. So what did they see? Now, a abbreviated history, very abbreviated, is that legend and folklore tells us about a mysterious cloth with a mysterious image on it that is brought to Edessa by the apostle Jude, circa 1st century. And Edessa at that time was in Syria. Now they've rearranged the boundaries, so now it's actually in Turkey. So this cloth was the story goes was responsible for the healing of King Abgar from leprosy, and he becomes a believer. But eventually, the persecution starts to reign, and so they hide this cloth away above the west gate of the city, and it's used and it's forgotten about for hundreds of years, and then rediscovered in the 6th century, and then but it remains in Edessa until 944 when it is taken to Constantinople, but in 1204 it's stolen by the French during the 4th Crusade. Now it goes underground for a while, and it's there's a period of time is about 150 years. We don't know really where it was, and then it shows up in Lorraine, France in 1353, goes on exhibit in 1356, then moves to Chambéry, France in 1450, ultimately to Turin, Italy in 1578. And is there a laser on here? I don't know if there is or isn't. So anyways, so now we have to ask, there's a, that trail was the probable historical trail if we assume that the cloth is authentic. But we have a problem, and the problem is that the shroud was carbon dated in 1988, and they said it had a date range of 1260 to 1390. So I guess I guess that's it. We can all go home now. And unless my name is Paul Harvey, and I'm going to tell you the rest of the story. Now, if you're under the age of 50, you're not going to even know what that means. You have to ask. Call your mom, and she'll explain it to you. So I'm going to tell you what happened versus what was supposed to happen. Now they had a protocol established in 1985 where they had agreed that they were supposed to cut at least 3 different samples from 3 different locations on the shroud, but they didn't do that. So what did they do? Now, this is the general location of that we see. Now, this image here is the full shroud. This is Henri's image from 1931. I use this because it's somewhat contrast enhanced. It's easier to see the image because the image on the cloth itself is very, very faint. So now, if you look at that top left corner, you'll see that there's a big chunk taken out of the shroud there. And so the shroud was in private ownership from 1453 until 1983. That's 530 years when it was owned by the Savoy family, and all the kings of Italy came out of the Savoy family either by blood or by marriage. And it appears in the early 1500s, one of the Savoys went a little crazy and started cutting off a big chunk of the shroud on the far left and a big chunk of the shroud on the far top right, and to cut these up into little snippets to give them away as royal gifts, because that would have been considered a first-class relic. Now we're going to drill down into this corner. Now you see on the very top left, the section that was cut out in the 1500s. And then we see up there, the section was cut out in 1973 for textile analysis. And then we see right adjacent to that is the section that was cut for carbon-14 dating. Now it's right below a seam in that darkened area. Now you can see that there is a diagram off to the right of there, and it shows you that there were 3 postage stamp size samples that were sent to the labs, and then there's a larger sample to the left that was cut for carbon dating, but was not carbon dated. It's called the reserve sample. So now, why is this a problem? Well, I'm going to show you the way that the shroud was exhibited over the centuries, and I'm going to show you etchings in silk and copper from 1578 to 1842. In fact, it was exhibited every year, annually, ever since 1418. That's even before the Savoys even came into ownership of it. So this is from 1578, and I think this is an etching, and I think the entire church is up there on the platform, everybody grabbing a hold of it, and it's I've put a big red arrow there to draw your attention to that corner that was cut for carbon dating. Now, the very next year, it's on exhibit again in 1579. I really appreciate the lovely bath towel that they have Jesus wrapped in there. But notice the red arrow drawing your attention to that corner. And then now May 4th became the official feast day of the Holy Shroud. And so every year it was exhibited annually on May 4th. And this is the exhibition was held in 1613. They build this platform. It's in the royal courtyard. And during this time, thousands of people would show up to 60,000 people would come to experience this on May 4th, the official feast day. And it's now, because it's owned by the Savoy family at this time, they would also bring it out to bless royal weddings. And so here's a royal wedding from 1684. And I really see where that arrow is. Look at the guy holding that corner. He's just grabbing a nice chunk of the shroud right there. I mean, it's in fact, it was exhibited this way with people holding or handling the shroud over 275 times since 1418 until 1694 every year. And so if you were looking for the worst possible sample location, you would pick from one of the two outside corners, which is exactly what they did, of course. And so now enter Ray Rogers. Ray Rogers, a thermal chemist with the Los Alamos National Laboratory, he began to suspect that perhaps there's something awry with that corner. And so he already has a thread sample from the Shroud in his possession from when he was the lead chemist on the Shroud project back in 1978. And then he obtains a thread sample from the middle of the reserve sample. Remember the sample that was cut for carbon dating but was not carbon dated? He obtains a thread sample from the middle of the reserve sample, and he compares them chemically, and they're not the same. And he goes on to publish in a peer-reviewed journal, and I may have to read this up here. It says this: in 1988, radiocarbon laboratories at Arizona, Cambridge, and Zurich determined the age of a sample from the Shroud of Turin. They reported that the date of the cloth's production lay between AD 1260 and 1390 with 95% confidence. This came as a surprise in view of the technology used to produce the cloth, its chemical composition, and the lack of vanillin in its lignin. The results prompted questions about the validity of the sample. Now he goes on, but here's the punchline. He says this: the radiocarbon sample was not part of the original cloth of the Shroud of Turin. The radiocarbon date was thus not valid for determining the true age of the Shroud. My goodness, what is he talking about? Well, in other words, what he found cotton mixed in with the flax in that corner, but there's no cotton anywhere else on the Shroud. And he found a madder root dye on the surface of the threads, but there's no dye anywhere else on the Shroud. And he found a clear splice where the cotton and the flax threads are spliced into each other. And he found the presence of starch to stiffen the threads to perhaps affect some kind of repair. So in other words, it seems that we have all the ingredients for some kind of a medieval reweave or some kind of a medieval repair. And so now we have to question, what did they date? Because how many of you know that cutting one sample into 3 pieces is not the same as taking 3 different samples? Now enter Tristan Casabianca from Paris, a French researcher, 2017. You see, now what happened is the Shroud was carbon dated in 1988. In 1989, the results were published in a scientific journal from Britain called Nature. Now, but here's the problem. For some reason, Nature didn't publish all of the raw data, only published some of the data. Well, that's interesting. Now, why do you think they did that? Maybe to achieve a 95% confidence. So now there have been numerous attempts over the years, numerous requests for the British Museum who oversaw all 3 labs to release all of the data, but they wouldn't release it until they were under duress from a Freedom of Information Act, and then they finally released all of the data. Now that's interesting. Now, so in 2019, Tristan, he publishes in a peer-reviewed journal called Archaeometry. I have to read this up here now. Assessing the new data, they found out that there's about 190-year difference between the laboratories. Now you think that that's a pretty big difference. Now they'll say, well, it's expected that there be a difference because they're not using the exact same equipment and maybe they're not exactly calibrated identically. Okay, fine. But why then is there a 161-year difference within the same lab, using the same equipment, measuring the same sample? That doesn't sound right. In fact, when you're using multiple laboratories, there's supposed to be at least a 60% correlation between those laboratories. But when you add in the new data, that correlation drops to only 28%. No wonder they didn't publish all the data. So now that makes me think that maybe this kid is right. And since we're using space age science, maybe Houston, maybe we have a problem here, huh? And so Tristan publishes in the last sentence of his peer-reviewed journal says, it is not possible to affirm that the 1988 radiocarbon dating offers, quote, conclusive evidence that the calendar age range is accurate and representative of the whole cloth. And he also said in an interview, he said secular media called the carbon dating a triumph of science over religion. Instead, it was a failure of the scientific process. Now what's really interesting is that there appears to be a gradient here. In other words, as you start from the bottom of the cloth, working north, working up, you're getting further into the cloth. And it appears now the median age for Oxford is 1200, is the year 1200. The median age for Zurich is 1270. And the median age for Arizona is 1310. Well, I'm seeing a pattern here. I'm seeing a direction. That suggests that maybe this is evidence of contamination, evidence of newer materials, like maybe some kind of reweave of some. Maybe there are some people that suggest that the cloth was subjected to some kind of a neutron event, and I think Father Spitzer is going to touch on that. So who knows? But I think this is really interesting. Now, lastly, about carbon dating, I'll introduce this. Giulio Fanti is a researcher and with Padua University in Italy. In 2013, they began to do it. Now, at this point, 2013, they were already 25 years past carbon dating, with obviously no interest in carbon dating it again. So they said to themselves, well, maybe there's another way that we can date this cloth. So they began collecting samples of other linens of a known age, about a dozen different linen samples from today, 1,000 years old, 2,000 years old, all the way back to 5,000 years old. And they begin to assess them, to do chemical analysis and mechanical analysis, mechanical meaning tensile strength, and then to determine a predictable rate of chemical and mechanical decay in these other linens. And by comparing fibers with the shroud, to comparing the amount of decay in fibers from the shroud, they gave the shroud an estimated date range by comparison with all these other linens, an estimated date range of 280 BC to 220 AD. Well, that's a 500-year range with first century right in the middle. So now who's right and who's wrong? So now we have to look a little closer at the historical trail. So what I want to show you, because it has been alleged repeatedly that the shroud's first historical appearance is 1356, when it was in the possession of Geoffrey de Charnay, and there's no historical evidence prior to the 14th century. Well, actually, that's nonsense. And so we're going to look at the historical trail, and we're going to look starting at the 4th century. Now, where do you think the tradition of covering the altar with a long linen cloth comes from? Where does that idea even come from? Now, this is from Pope Sylvester in 325 AD by papal decree. He declares that the church should celebrate the holy sacrifice of the Mass, representing the body and blood of Christ, on a linen cloth as if it were the clean shroud of Christ. Suggests that maybe there was knowledge of the shroud in existence at that time. Now, the next century, this is Theodore, Bishop Theodore of Mopsuestia of Antioch, and he developed a catechism with the instructions before the celebration of the Mass. And this is, I'll have to read this one up here, that's too small. But he says this: when they bring up the oblation at the offertory, I had to look that up. So I said, okay, now these are the communion elements before they are sanctified by the priest, okay? And so he says, they place it on the altar for the completed representation of the passion, so that we may think of him on the altar as if he were placed in the sepulchre after having received the passion. This is why the deacons, 2 deacons, who spread the linens on the altar represent the figure on the linen cloths at the burial. What's he talking about? The two deacons bring this linen cloth, this long, narrow, rectangular cloth. They bring it down, they lay it over the altar, and those two deacons represent the figure on the cloth. Sounds like maybe a double image here, like we see the frontal and dorsal images on the shroud. Now, this is the kicker right here. This is astonishing. This is called the Mozarabic Rite of Holy Week. This is liturgy that is brought to Spain by a group of Arab Catholics in the 6th century. And they translate John chapter 20, verse 5. We just read it earlier. It's the first thing we read. Now, they translate the same verse of scripture this way. They say, Peter ran with John to the tomb and saw the recent imprints of the dead and risen man on the linens. Now, that's their translation of John chapter 20, verse 5. That's not in our translation, but that's how they translated it. Now, that's interesting because now that's not in our Bible, but it's 1,500 years old. Does it go all the way back to first century? I don't know. From those two previous references, I think maybe it does. Now, remember I told you that the shroud goes to Edessa, is hidden away, rediscovered in the 6th century. And from that moment on, it's safe to be a Christian now. We're 200 years past Constantine. So this cloth is it becomes known as the image of Edessa. It is described as the true likeness of Christ, not made by human hands. And from this moment on, all of your Orthodox Byzantine icons of Jesus change, and they change dramatically. You see, prior to this time, depictions of Jesus were all over the board. Short hair, clean shaven, sometimes long hair, clean shaven, sometimes looking off this way, sometimes looking off. But ever since the true likeness, always front-facing, long hair, full beard, large hollow eyes, flattened nose, very stylistically identical to what we see on the shroud. Now, that's all I'm going to say about that. 8th century. Regarding the Apostle Jude, why the Apostle Jude brought the sacred cloth to King Abgar, Theodore the Studite in 787 said, I have to read it up here. He said it was to clearly grant his divine features, our Savior, who had been covered with it, imprinted the form of his own face, portraying it touching the cloth with his own skin. Now, over there on the picture on the right is a 12th century rendition of the Apostle Jude, or who is presenting the cloth to Abgar. Now, it's been said that this image of Edessa, this true likeness of Christ, even known as the Mendelian, is only a face image. Well, actually, maybe it started off as being only understood as a face image because it was described as tetradiplune, meaning doubled in 4. You double the cloth in 4, and all you're going to see is a face image. But there is this increasing revelation over time that this is a full body image. Now, watch this next one. Now, wait a minute. So again, from the 8th century, this is Pope Stephen III. Christ spread out his entire body on a linen cloth that was white as snow. On this cloth, marvelous as it is to see, the glorious image of the Lord's face, and the length of his entire and most noble body has been divinely transferred. Well, obviously now we're not talking about just a face image. Now, again, from the 8th century, King Abgar, wait a minute, received a cloth on which one can see not only a face, but the whole body. And here's more historical references from the 6th century. The divinely wrought image which the hands of men did not form. 9th century, the city of Edessa, in which there was preserved a blood-stained image of the Lord, not made by hands. Now, notice how they're all saying not made by human hands. It's because this gets back to the notion that this is not a graven image. They're saying, look, we didn't do this. We don't know who did it, but we did not do this. And so this is, and so there, it's also known in Greek as meaning archaeopoetis. I probably said that wrong, but archaeopoetis archiopoetus, which means not made by human hands, but that I had a good friend of mine, an Episcopal priest, Father Kim Dreisbach. He used to describe it as being something touched by God for the purpose of touching others. I thought that's really a neat definition of what archiopoetus means. And here's two more. From the 10th century, it is described as a moist secretion without pigment or painter's art. The 10th century, again, it was described as he was barely able to make out an outline. And again, this image here is more contrast enhanced. It's actually much fainter, more faint than what you're seeing here. Now, not by 944, Edessa had fallen to Islam, and the emperor in Constantinople was very concerned about the safety and well-being of this most holy of all Christian relics. And so he sent the entire Byzantine army down to Edessa, surrounded the city, but he wasn't looking for a fight. He brought with him 200 prisoners of war, bags of silver. He was just looking for a trade. And the Muslims are pretty sharp, and they said, we'll take that deal. And so without any kind of bloodshed at all, they returned to Constantinople on August 16th, 944. Now this is a interesting picture here. This is an 11th century rendition by John of Skylitzes, but you see the Hagia Sophia in the background. Now, in the middle, you see the man in blue. That's the general of the army. To the left of him is the army. Now, to the right of him is the emperor dressed in black. And in between the emperor and the general is a third image. It's a face image. You see it? Which is telling you that there's an image on this cloth. Now, wait a minute, though. This is not some little square little towel. Notice how it's draped over the emperor's arm several times, all the way over the general's back. So we're talking about a long linen cloth with the face at the center of it, kind of where we see it on the shroud. Now, that evening, August 16th, 944, Gregory, the archdeacon of the Hagia Sophia, he has they do a special solemn celebration in the palace. And in this celebration, they lay this burial shroud out on the emperor's throne, and they crown it with the emperor's crown. Well, that's some symbolism. And then here's Gregory standing next to it, pointing things out on this cloth. And here's what he says. He says, the splendor has been impressed uniquely by the drops of agony sweat sprinkled from the face. These are truly the beauties that produce the coloring of Christ's imprint, which has been embellished further by the drops of blood sprinkled from his own side. Blood and water there, sweat and image here. Sweat and image here, he's pointing to the face image. He's not talking about paint, is he? He's talking about sweat and image. And but then he points to the side wound up there, that elliptical, and the little clear areas in that blood stain have been proven to be the separation of blood and blood serum, which occurs after death when the blood is no longer circulating, but it appears like blood and water. 11th century. Tell him I'm not here. The 11th century. This is a response from Jesus to King Abgar's request for him to come to Edessa to heal the king. So this is again a hearkening back to that first century story of Abgar being healed by Jude bringing the linen cloth to him. It says this. But if you wish to see my face in the flesh, behold, I send to you a linen on which you will discover not only the features of my face, but a divinely copied configuration of my entire body. Now, from the 13th century, this is from Gervais of Tilbury, circa 12 to 13. It says that the story is passed down from the archives of ancient authority. Now stop right there. He's telling you that in 1213, it didn't just arrive here in 1213, it has been passed down over the centuries. He goes on and says that the Lord prostrated himself with his entire body on the whitest linen. So by divine power, there was impressed on the linen a most beautiful imprint of not only the face, but the entire body of the Lord. Now, This is from 1201 from Constantinople. It says, in this place, the naked Lord rises again, and the burial linen can prove it. Now, 1204 is the beginning of the Fourth Crusade. Horrible chapter of Christian history. But in 1203, the Crusaders arrived there, and they haven't begun battling anything yet. And so some of the Crusaders were allowed into the city to wander around, and one of them was a French chronicler by the name of Robert de Clary. And this is what he observes. And I'll read this up here. He says, talking about the Church of St. Mary of Blachernae. Blachernae was a section of Constantinople, within which was the shroud wherein our Lord was wrapped on every Friday. Was wrapped. And on every Friday, that shroud did raise itself upright so that the form of our Lord could clearly be seen. And none knows, neither Greek nor French, that is, what became of that shroud when the city was taken. So he's observing something here in this church. Now, this icon image on your right is called the Man of Sorrows. It has Jesus rising up out of a box. And we think, and we believe that there was this liturgical kind of a device that they had made for displaying the shroud. And it had it hooked up on some kind of a pulley system. And so at 6 o'clock in the morning, first watch, they raise it up a couple feet, represents Jesus as a baby. At 9 o'clock, raise it up a little bit further. That represents Jesus as a boy. Raise it up a little further at 12 noon. That represents Jesus as a man. Raise it all the way up at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That represents Jesus, the crucified Lord. That's the exact same time in which Jesus gave up his spirit on the cross. And so they would do this every Friday. And so that's what he was observing. And that's what we think this Man of Sorrows icon is depicting. Now, the Fourth Crusade did happen shortly after this. The Crusaders went to war. They broke into the city. They burned down half of the buildings. They steal all the ivory, silver, and gold, and hundreds of relics that were there. And as you can imagine, a letter of protest was written the following year by the brother of the emperor. It says this, and excuse me. In April of last year, a crusading army, having falsely set out to liberate the Holy Land, instead laid waste the city of Constantine. During the sack, troops of Venice and France looted even the holy sanctuaries. The Venetians partitioned the treasures of gold, silver, and ivory, while the French did the same with the relics of the saints. And most sacred of all, the linen in which our Lord Jesus Christ was wrapped after his death and before his resurrection. So this cloth was in Constantinople in 1204 and was stolen during the Fourth Crusade. Now, let's get cynical for a minute. Clearly, there is a linen cloth with an image of Jesus on it that was in existence in Edessa and Constantinople. And it disappears in 1204. The question is it the same shroud that's in Turin, Italy today? Well, obviously not, because the carbon dating says it has a date range of 1260 to 1390, so it can't possibly be the same shroud. Really? Let's see about that. Now, here we see, now remember, Barry talked about those big burns that occurred in 1532 when it was sealed up in like a silver box, was folded up, the top of the box melted, and a glob of molten silver fell down onto the cloth, creating this kind of origami burn effect, okay? Now, we see the big burns. Now, we see our past Pope, he's holding a censer. And you know what a censer is. A censer has hot coals in the bottom of it. He puts incense on top of the coals, which causes the incense to burn, and the incense, and that which causes the smoke to waft up. And the smoke represents what? Prayers of the saints, right? So we think that there was an incident that occurred when the shroud was in Constantinople, maybe even Edessa, that it was folded up on the altar, obviously representing the body and blood of Christ, right? And the bishop was going around the table with this censer when there was an oops moment. And when the censer hits the table, hot coals fall onto the cloth, burning all the way through it. So you can see this little interesting L-shaped pattern of burns. I'm going to show you a composite. It starts at the top left, then goes to the bottom left, then goes to the bottom right, and ends up at the top right. And so now here is a copy of the shroud made in 1516 and it's from Leer, Belgium. And notice how this is before the big burns, so you don't see them. What do you see? The painter, the artist, clearly depicts an L-shaped pattern of burns. So now we don't know exactly when these burns got here, but watch this. This is called the Hungarian Prey manuscript. This is from 1192. This is the first book ever bound in the Hungarian language, and it's basically about the history of Hungary. And Hungary at this time was aligned with Constantinople. Now there are some picture codexes in this book depicting the scenes of the life of Christ. Here's the crucifixion scene. So scene 1 up above, we see Jesus laid out on his burial shroud. Scene 2 down below, we see Jesus wrapped in his burial shroud. So now I'm going to drill down on this. We're just going to look at the top panel. We have the image of a naked man. That's interesting because you saw all those etchings earlier. We had Jesus wrapped in bath towels and boxer shorts, but here he is naked, which is exactly how he is on the shroud. Now, we also see that there are 4 fingers and no thumbs. On the shroud, there are 4 fingers and no thumbs. And I'm sure Father Spitzer is going to talk about that, so I won't go into it. He will. Now, we're going to go to the bottom panel now. Now, the bottom panel is very instructive. Now, you see that there's an angel on the far left, and then you have the 3 women, or the Mary Magdalene in the middle. To her right is Mary, the mother of James, and to her right is Simone, who was a disciple. These are the women identified in the Gospel of Mark. Now, Mary Magdalene, if you'll notice that superimposed over her right arm is a face image that's telling you that there's an image inside this cloth. Do you see it? Now notice this. There is those zigzag lines on the top cloth, on the top portion, that denotes the very distinctive herringbone pattern weave of the shroud, and I'll show you that in just a minute. And then we also have the L-shaped pattern of burns, and which in the exact same configuration as we see on the shroud. Now, there's one thing I want to point out, though, that a lot of people don't point out when they're talking about the Hungarian Prey manuscript, and I think it's really significant. And that's this. We have this cloth. Notice this picture here is a long, narrow, rectangular cloth enveloping the body lengthwise. That sounds interesting. That sounds like it's more than a coincidence. In fact, there's any number of ways to wrap a corpse. In fact, you could be wrapped in a burial shroud if you wanted to. You can order one right now on Amazon, $300, comes with straps and all. And now, do you know what the size of that cloth is? 6 by 9. This kind of makes sense. You know what the size of the Shroud of Turin is? 3.5 feet by 14 feet. Long, rectangular, narrow cloth, exactly what we see here. And it's exactly what was used to cover the altar, going all the way back to the 4th century. Now let's look at the zigzag lines. You'll see over there to the bottom right, the zigzag pattern that correlates with the herringbone pattern weave of the shroud. And clearly we see the L-shaped pattern of burn holes that clearly line up with the shroud. There are 11 distinctive attributes of the Hungarian Prey manuscript that exactly match the Shroud of Turin. Folks, that's called a fingerprint. That's called a DNA match. So you put it all together. The historical references, the influence of ancient icon images, the Hungarian Prey manuscript all point to one conclusion. The shroud dates to at least the 3rd century and probably 1st. I don't know what went wrong with carbon dating. All I know is that this shroud was in Constantinople in 1204. which is now the oldest carbon date is 1260. So that's already older than the oldest carbon date. And it didn't just get there in 1204, it had been there for hundreds of years. So I don't know what went wrong with carbon dating. All I can tell you is that it's wrong, period, end of story. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Russ. So we've gone from the STIRP research to the history. And now, fittingly, finally, Father Robert Spitzer, comparing the shroud with the Gospels. Could it be Jesus? Please welcome Father Spitzer.
Well, again, I want to welcome everybody here and thank you for being here. And I want to thank the Museum of the Bible staff for making this incredible exhibit possible. I saw it this morning. It really is very much worth seeing. I'm going to just give a quick overview of some of the information from the blood. And then I'm going to go to my PowerPoints, which really gets us to the heart of the matter, which is the resurrection evidence that I think is there on the image. As Barry said, still today, we do not have the full explanation, but we are getting closer. And I want to explain the particle radiation hypothesis vis-a-vis the vacuum ultraviolet radiation hypothesis in just a moment. But first, the blood evidence. To begin with, these are not red stains, as Barry and Russ have already intimated, right? Obviously, paints, dyes, rubs of various kinds do not have partial DNA sequences, AB positive blood type, certainly don't have, whole blood, human whole blood, albumin, human albumin, certainly don't have either, creatinine and ferritin, synthesis of two enzymes that come together only really when people are experiencing a polytrauma, as Jesus did. How would a medieval forger even begin to insert this into the shroud, unless you want to say that a medieval forger actually took a human being and forced him to undergo all the traumas of Jesus, inserting remarkably the imprints of Roman weapons, which I'll talk about in just a moment, and using Roman crucifixion customs, which he would have never had any idea about. And, in order to produce blood that resembled that of Jesus, particularly to get bilirubin and creatinine and ferritin to actually resemble the polytrauma of Jesus. I mean, it's an absurd hypothesis, but just to let you know, it's very much real blood. It's human blood. It's AB probably positive blood, and that's what I'm going to just start with for just a moment. Now, just taking a look at Jesus's crucifixion very, very quickly. There are a lot of unique aspects to this crucifixion, and I'm just going to sum them up very quickly to get to the image properties. First of all, we don't have, in the vast literature on crucifixion in Roman history, we don't have another crucifixion with a crown of thorns. Why would that be? How did the particular kind of crown that's on the shroud, how is that known to a medieval forger? But to begin with, why the crown of thorns? Because that is particular to the accusation against Jesus. Blasphemy, of course, for the Jewish people, for the Jewish authorities. However, in the case of Jesus, he claimed to be, quote unquote, king of the Jews. And therefore, this kind of, disrespect that was done to him by the soldiers and the weaving of the crown. Interestingly enough, in order to weave that crown, you do kind of come up with a top, but there's a kind of expertise in the way this is weaved so that all these thorns that are on the top, that are where the blood vessels and the nerves in the top of the head are really congealed. Boom! It's just set onto the head. How did a medieval forger know to do this? How did a medieval forger know that the twisting action would produce a top on the crown? Because all that medieval forger would have ever seen is a circlet around the head of Jesus. Furthermore, when you look at the number of whippings that the man received, probably very close to the maximum, You can see that it's done by a Roman flagrum, which just didn't exist in the Middle Ages. Did he suddenly go into an excavation in Pompeii and find one and know how to imitate it with 3 thongs? And of course, on the end of each thong, there's this barbell-shaped lead pellets that are literally going into the side of the man on each side. And of course, the whipping is taking place from left to right to left to right, with different sized men doing the whipping. And of course, it's coming right around the side of the man in the shroud. And it's just as they pull the whip back, the thongs back, it's tearing his flesh to pieces. And you can see, where did a medieval forger get the sense of a Roman flagrum, or how the Roman custom of moving from left to right, how did he know to imitate this, going all the way down to the ankles, starting all the way up almost by the nape of the neck? How did he know? How did he know, again, just exactly how to place that nail in the palm of the hand? So if you're really looking at this, as Frederick Zugby actually saw, the nail goes inside, it hits that medial nerve as it's going in, but the protrusion point is out the back of the wrist, but the frontal part comes in and going down at a 20-degree angle into the palm, hitting that medial nerve, which collapses the thumb, which is why you don't see the thumbs, because they're buried inside the palms, on the shroud. And so you look at that and you go, how did that guy know all this? I mean, he's just a veritable source book in human anatomy, and he lived in the Middle Ages. So of course, I'll just leave it with that. He's got the placement correct for the spear. Now, it's taken us a little bit of time to figure this out, but you'll notice that oval shape that Russ pointed out, almost shaped like a little bit like an oak leaf almost. And that's exactly the kind of a spear that was used by people who were stationed, Roman soldiers that were stationed in Jerusalem. Just how a medieval person would have known that the spear of the Roman legion would be similarly shaped in its head. It's just impossible for him to get this knowledge, but nevertheless, it's emblazoned there right on the shroud, going up between the 5th and the 6th ribs. It's going up at about a 35-degree angle. And what's happening there as that spear is going up between the 5th and 6th rib on the right side is it's going to protrude into a little cavity near the lung, which is filled up with water, well, a watery substance, let's call it. It's filled up with liquid, pulmonary liquids, and that's gone into that cavity. And then, of course, it hits the heart. And as it does so, as the soldier just jerks it back to bring it out, which he probably did it in a quick jerk, out would have come blood first, then the water from the cavity. Just saying. And the watery substance is right there, emblazoned on the precise place between the 5th and 6th ribs. What a remarkable knowledge of anatomy. How did he know that it would protrude the atrium first, then go into the pulmonary sac, and so forth and so on? I don't think so. This is not a tenable hypothesis, but it's emblazoned there on the shroud. It is really a figure crucified in the unique way of Jesus. The Romans really didn't go around putting people out of their misery ahead of time. They liked them to suffer a lot. And what does that mean? That means that soldier, probably just like the gospel said, he's coming upon the beginning of the Sabbath. He sees that Jesus is dead, just to be sure, doesn't want to go through the process of breaking his bones, puts the lance in his side, jerks it out comes blood and water. John is so fascinated by this event that he literally says, this is seen by an eyewitness, and he knows that his witness is true. And da-da-da-da-da-da. Well, why does the Dom doth protest too much, or in this case, the man doth protest too much? Because he thinks his audience isn't going to believe this one. Water pouring out of the side of Christ. Indeed, it happened. And the watery substance is evidence there on the shroud. In any case, my brief overview of this more than fascinating set of bloodstains, not to mention, of course, the serum separation from the plasma that is evident, as I believe it was either Barry or Russ said. Much of this is completely, you wouldn't have known that some of these serum, the embedded serum is there present on the shroud without current technology to reveal it. So this, I have to tell you, this is not only genuine blood. I think it's the blood of a man crucified in an identical way to Jesus, a unique crucifixion indeed, complete with spears, complete with crowns of thorns, and on top of it, using Roman weaponry and Roman customs. It might be a little beyond a medieval forger. But now I get into another area, the whole image formation. Truly, I will try to establish quite beyond a medieval forger. Maybe I will just subtitle what I'm going to say right now is, he has risen as he promised. My hope is to try and clarify that statement today. It's a mystery. We have to keep getting clarification, but something really remarkable happened. Let's go back first to the problems of the image formation. By the way, this is the most remarkable thing in the world. If my suspicion is correct, the particle radiation hypothesis is a correct hypothesis. But essentially, we've got a series of problems. We've got 32 enigmatic primary image features on the shroud. I mean, this very straw yellow color that's present there. It's a precise, as many people have mentioned, three-dimensional photographic negative image. It's got actually depth layering on it. So that's very important to know. It's got depth layering. So you can actually not only see depth, let's say where the cloth is not touching the body, right? But you can see not only the image of the body, you get it in the precise intensity, and this is important, in the precise intensity in the inverse from its distance between the cloth and the body. Now that is really remarkable. You're basically like getting MRI image layering on this photo that's there in a photographic negative. I mean, a medieval forger? Come on, give me a break. Okay, so this is the key thing that's really crucial to notice is the image not only is between the body surface and the cloth, where you begin to see action at a distance, where you begin to see no contact at all. All of a sudden you see this remarkable correlation between the distance between the cloth and the body and the intensity of the image. It goes into the inside of the body. This is bizarre. That cloth is going to have to penetrate that body at least 3/16 of an inch, because what you see there, for example, let's take the man's backbone, right? You can see the man's backbone in the shroud, but you can also see that the intensity of the backbone is less than the flesh of the back, which is covering the backbone. You can see that the image of the bones, right, in there is less intense than the flesh that's covering the hands, covering the bones in the hands. So you can see very clearly there's not just interior imaging, but there's also layering, depth layering. Maybe we could just call it what it is, three-dimensional layering, like an MRI on the shroud on the basis of its intensity relative to the distance from the cloth. Now, you look at that and you say, well, 32 image features, would you name them all? Yeah, one of them was already named, I think, by Barry or Russ, right? There's no fluorescing in the image sections, right? Whereas there's ordinary fluorescing of linen, of cellulose on the parts of the shroud that don't have any image on it. Very curious indeed. What's even more curious is you'll notice that there's the dorsal part of the surface, right? The dorsal surface of the shroud. And of course, Jesus is, the man on the body. Let's keep the hypothesis going for a second. The man laying in the shroud, he's lying supine, pressuring the dorsal surface of the shroud. And then, of course, we have the front part of the shroud, as Russ just described it, right? It's going over the head of the man down to the feet. And that part of the cloth is just, put there, and it would just have to fall down. But here's the interesting thing. That interior imaging of the back side, the dorsal side, and the frontal side is identical in intensity relative to the distance between the part of the body imaged and the distance from the cloth, the distance that it would take to move from that body part to the cloth. Now that is truly bizarre. How come pressure has no effect whatsoever? How come the dorsal image, and the frontal image, with the dorsal image just having the full weight of the body on it, how can it be of equal intensity to the frontal part? Well, John Jackson, let me just skip to the next slide for a second. Let me go back in time for just 1 minute before I get to the John Jackson 2 requirements. There's 3 people: John Jackson, Eric Jumper, and William Erkeline. Okay, and I think it was 1982 and 1984. They wrote some articles, 2 big ones, massive kind of articles that really do go through all the various possibilities for how the image could have been put on the cloth. Could it have been done by chemicals? Could it have been done by art? Could it have been done by scorching? And Barry pointed out so many of these things already, and they went through all the various possibilities. Basically, we've got a real problem. The real problem is, and John Jackson points this out in I think it was 91 and 93, he wrote 2 really important seminal articles. He was one of the physicists on the team. Kind of the overarching physicist of the team in many respects. John Jackson writes these 2 articles. And in those articles, he basically points out, first of all, there's only one option left. The image production has to meet 2 major criteria. The first of which is radiation. The only way you're going to get an explanation of all 32 primary image features, all 8 secondary image features, and all the other enigmatic features of that cloth or the blood, the only way you're going to do it is if you have radiation coming from not just the surface of the body, coming from the inside of the body and the surface of the body. So that's the first thing. It's going to have to be radiation. Of course, there's visible radiation, and that gives rise to blinding light kind of thing, or it could be very high intensity, high frequency radiation, different kinds of light, etc. But the main thing is you're going to have some form of radiation, and radiant energy oftentimes gives off light. Now, the second part that you're going to have to, criterion you're going to have to meet, is that body's going to have to become mechanically transparent. Let's just face facts. You're not going to get interior imaging, which is layered relative to the distance between the cloth and the body, unless you have radiation from the inside of the body moving up toward the cloth, and the cloth collapsing into the body and picking up that radiation on the inside. That's the only way you're going to get it. Now, his article has been out there since 1991 and 93, I believe it is. He's had that information there. I think it is a classic thesis. And by the way, there's a wonderful lawyer, also has put, Mark Antonacci is his name, has put together this list of 32 primary features, 8 secondary features. If you look at his article written in 2012, it's free on shroud.com. Just go over to that article. I think it's called Particle Radiation Could Explain All of the Enigmas on the Cloth. He has another book out there called Test the Shroud on the Atomic and Molecular Level. Okay, the point that I'm getting to though is the body has to become mechanically transparent. Let's just call it spiritual. And let's, for a second, it's not going to create any resistance. But the interesting thing about one of the theories that is used to explain it is that there might even be a vacuum that's created in the particle radiation hypothesis, which I'll talk about in a moment, which would draw up the backside of the cloth in the same way as the front side of the cloth is being pulled into it. More on that in a moment. But radiation we need, mechanical transparency we need. And I'm telling you right now, dead human corpses just don't instantaneously become mechanically transparent and start radiating energy, rather powerful energy, from every three-dimensional part, directionally from the body as well as the surface. It just doesn't happen. I mean, we're talking about something really weird. Maybe we even want to call it mysterious, supernatural, however you want to phrase it. But we'll talk about that in a minute. Let's go to the two big hypotheses that are out there right now. One of them is called the ultraviolet radiation hypothesis. Let's just call it the URH for a second. That is a good tested hypothesis. And we've got another one called the particle radiation hypothesis. These are the two big ones out there. The ultraviolet radiation hypothesis, John Jackson first came up with it, but it was tested by Paolo di Lazzaro and all the very, very fine physicists over there at the Frascati labs, which is, the big laboratory for testing new technologies in Italy. It's like a national lab. And they did test it in 2010, and they noticed that it really explained about 22 of the enigmatic features on the primary enigmatic features on the shroud. So that straw yellow color that you see, if you basically use about 6 to 8 billion watts of light energy for 1/40 billionth of a second produced by ARF excimer lasers, you're going to get that coloration. You're going to get that coloration on a cloth with the same spectral reflectance as the shroud. And in addition to that, you're going to get that same precise three-dimensional photographic negative image that's on the shroud. So Di Lazzaro and those guys in 2010 have really proven that this is a possible hypothesis to explain it. Again, it's a very comprehensive theory. It is a very good theory, but I think there's a better theory, a more comprehensive theory that has been put together. What are the advantages? Some of the advantages of the ultraviolet radiation hypothesis. Obviously, the coloration. Obviously, 22 of the enigmatic primary features can be explained. Obviously, the action at a distance aspect can be explained. And even to a certain extent, other kinds of image peculiarities can be explained. But here's the part. Now I'm going to go to the second big theory, and that's the particle radiation hypothesis. There's a few people that are involved in this. One of them is Dr. Kitty Little. She's over there at the reactor there at Harwell in UK. And then we also have Dr. Jean-Baptiste. Pardon? Oh, right, yeah, Ronaldo. I'm gonna forget him. But anyway, Jean-Baptiste Ronaldo, and he is in France. He also happens to be a priest, but a very top-ranked nuclear physicist there at a research institute in France. The two of them actually showed that under low temperature radiation, both in France and in Britain, the reactors there, like temperatures, it didn't get above 170 degrees. And low temperature is the big thing. That if you have a low temperature reaction, you can get the same kind of yellow straw coloration on a cloth with the same spectral reflectance as on the Shroud of Turin. And in addition to that, you can explain every one of those 45 enigmas, 32 primary image features, 8 secondary features, and 5 other really important features like the bright red color of the cloth, et cetera. Even you will get another theory for why a carbon dating was off by a factor of 1,300 years. 5 minutes? Okay, let me just explain this really quickly. First thing that's important is when the hypothesis is that you have complete disintegration, nuclear disintegration of the body. So in other words, what happens when the man is in the shroud is that all of the stable, these are stable atomic nuclei, all of the stable atomic nuclei in that body are going to literally disappear. They're going to disintegrate simultaneously. Now, this does not happen often, if ever. There's just no, they're stable atomic nuclei. Why would they just simply disintegrate in a low temperature nuclear reaction? I do not know. But what happens when those nuclei disintegrate is they give off a whole slew of particles. That's why it's called particle radiation hypothesis. And they give off, some of them are heavy charged particles. Heavy charged particles, just keep that in mind for a second. That's like protons, that's like alpha particles, that's like deuterons, things of that nature. What do? They are attenuated in air. They just can't travel very far at all. And the minute they hit that cloth, that's it. They're going to leave their effect, and it'll be an effect embedded on the uppermost surface of the fibrils of the cloth. It won't ever penetrate. The heavy charged particles will not penetrate. And furthermore, it will do so on the distance from the intensity of the effect on the cloth will be in direct proportion to the distance or the closeness of the body to the cloth, or in inverse proportion, the further away you are, the less intense the image will be. Okay, that's the heavy charged particles, and that's one big, huge part of the cloth. The second, you have another flow, which everybody has been calling the neutron flux. One of those things is neutrons. They're very heavy particles, but they're not charged. Then you have electrons, which are light particles, but they are charged. And then you have gamma rays, which are like very excited photons. Okay, the main thing to remember, though, is those particles can penetrate right through the cloth. Now, I'm just going to give me just 5 minutes to sum up the fantastic number of things that this particle radiation hypothesis explains. The first thing, of course, is you're probably wondering, how did that body get out of the cloth without smearing or breaking or distorting any of those bloodstains? How is that possible? There is no human or mechanical means available, absolutely none, where you could have all that dried blood on that body sticking to that cloth and then have either a mechanical or human device just take that shroud off. It would have certainly smeared, distorted, broken, the majority of those blood images, but none. Something very, very strange going on here. There has to be another way the body got out of that cloth. The second thing that is very important relative to this thing is, well, wait a minute. Let me just give you the explanation. If the body disappears, if it completely nuclear disintegrates, it leaves the blood where it is, and everything that's part of the body disintegrates, but everything that's already detached from the body does not disintegrate, you got your explanation. Particle vacuum radiation. It's going to happen when the body disintegrates. And by the way, you get a twofer with the PRH, with the particle radiation hypothesis. You get an explanation for the mechanical transparency of the body, and you get an explanation for the radiation and with all the intensities that are there, which can explain the interior imaging. Are you going to get an explanation for the interior imaging? Absolutely. Not only are you going to get an explanation for the interior imaging, you're going to see why it is like magnetic resonance imaging, because the bone, right, this body, which is, this cloth is going right through the body. It is giving rise to these heavy charged particles, and they're embedding themselves according to the exact intensity on the shroud. Can I just go through just the five really enigmas? I'll just do this very quick very quickly. Okay, so we get an explanation for everything. In fact, let me just skip to the 4 and just say, hey, we're going to get an explanation for all 32 of those primary feature enigmas, and we're going to get an explanation for all 8 secondary feature enigmas, and I can talk about those in the Q&A later. The next thing that's really important is that blood. And okay, great. I got it, and I will use them wisely. Okay, the next thing that's very important here is to notice that that bright red color of the blood. Everybody wonders, well, is it because of the bilirubin content in the blood? That no doubt has something to do with it. But the bilirubin content in the blood, it's varied throughout the different blood stains. So how do you get that consistent bright red throughout? All you need to do is do what Jean-Baptiste did, Ronaldo did in 1998, where he actually irradiated that blood with neutrons. And what happened? It came out that bright red color. And you put it in UV energy, like UV radiation, or, like the shroud is out in exposition and it gets into the sunlight. Bango, the same bright red light. Without respect to the bilirubin content in any of the stains, the bright red color is the same, just exactly as we find it on the shroud. Let's just keep going really quickly to some other features. What about that dorsal and frontal dimension of the shroud being equal? When you have basic disintegration of the entire body simultaneously, there's not only the radiation, almost as if the radiation, as the body is fading away, it's giving its own picture through the radiation that is emanating in those protons, deuterons, and alpha particles, right? But what's really interesting at the same moment that all of this is happening is it's creating a vacuum. And the vacuum is pulling that shroud, the dorsal part of the shroud, up into the backside of the man. And you've got the vacuum sucking the front side down in the exact proportions. And of course, pressure is no longer a factor because the mechanical transparency makes, of course, the pressure a non-factor. The nuclear disintegration makes it a non-factor. So you've got that explanation done. Let's just go really quickly. Why is it that the shroud has such incredible category? It's resistant to degradation. It's resistant to solvency. It's resistant to chemical reactions. It's resistant to oxygenation. How is this possible? The reason is because, remember those neutrons? When those neutrons are penetrating that cloth, they're breaking all of these chains of the cellulose. Some of them go through crystalline regions, some of them go through non-crystalline regions. Non-crystalline regions are weak, crystalline regions are strong. When those neutrons penetrate and break those bonds in the non-crystalline regions, the weak ones, they reform and connect, they relink with the strong crystalline regions. And by the way, this has been tested by Ronaldo, Jean-Baptiste Ronaldo, and by Dr. Kitty Little in the laboratory, and found to be exactly that. It gets that resistance to solvency, oxygenation, and chemical reaction, which of course allows the shroud to just outlast, fibers of its kind. It's remarkable. How come the image doesn't fluoresce on the very front of the image? Because now we have found that once you irradiate with heavy charged particles like protons, deuterons, and alpha particles, you irradiate a linen cloth with those heavy charged particles, which only exist in the image part of the shroud, it takes away all of the possibility of fluorescing. And leaves, of course, remember, the heavy charged particles are coming from the body, right? So all the other parts of the shroud, they didn't get heavy charged particles irradiating them. They basically still fluoresce like linen always fluoresces, but not the image. It's been neutralized by the particle radiation. Just two more quick things, and I'll just, this is really fascinating from the vantage point of carbon dating. We've already heard that there's a very good reason from the sample from Russ, from the sample itself, why you would have an errant carbon dating because of the very place where the sample was taken. But there's another very good reason, and it may disprove the possibility of ever carbon dating the shroud. We'll have to go back to one of, Giulio Fanti did those other three that Russ talked about. He did an infrared, a Fourier transformed infrared spectroscopy, a Raman laser spectroscopy, and intention compressibility, mechanical transmissibility, intention test. And he got that dating of the first century plus or minus 200 years from those three tests. We may have to make recourse to those in the future because carbon dating may not be the solution to the problem. And here's why. Let's suppose a particle radiation hypothesis is correct. Let's suppose that there's a ton of neutrons just streaming up from that body. Well, what happens when you irradiate there's what's called indigenous nitrogen isotope called N14. It's all over the place in cellulose, right? So what happens when you irradiate that indigenous N14 isotope? It turns into what? You got it, C14 on a huge level. There's a wonderful study that's been done by this guy, Dr. Arthur Lind, and he shows that you irradiate cellulose and all that N14 turns into C14 just in a matter of a split second. You could get enough additional C14 into that shroud to throw off that dating, like any carbon dating, into the future by 1,300 years. And moreover, it's going to stay. It's not going to fade. It's going to be as indigenous, that C14 is going to be as indigenous to the cellulose of that shroud as the nitrogen 14 was to the shroud. Well, I leave you with a mystery, but I'll tell you one thing. The particle radiation hypothesis is a pretty darn good hypothesis. And if any, it explains everything. It literally explains everything. Now there's a way of confirming it. And the way of confirming it, all we need is one more test to look for some other isotopes, radioactive isotopes in there. So if we can find chlorine 36, or we can find calcium 41, which are cosmogenic radioactive isotopes, if we find that in the cloth in a future dating, that cloth was irradiated by a whole lot of neutrons and particles. And if that is the case, PRH is probably correct. In which case, I'm telling you, Christ left us a little bit of a remnant of the resurrection there, because ordinary bodies or corpses really don't simultaneously destabilize and disintegrate in all of their atomic nuclei simultaneously, giving rise to a shower of protons, deuterons, neutrons, and gamma rays that give an image off of itself, strengthening the cloth, brightening the blood stains, and doing everything imaginable to give us an image of the Lord in his risen glory. Thanks so very much for your patience, letting me go over time.
So again, thank you everyone for joining us today. I'd also like to introduce not new to us, but new to the day, Professor Cheryl White from Louisiana State University in Shreveport. She has spoken here at the museum before and was also, along with Russ, I should have mentioned, one of the two external reviewers of our exhibition script and content. So very helpful to the museum processes. So please welcome Cheryl White.
Thank you.
Okay, so a lot of questions, and I'm going to pick something random. I guess this is a historical question here.
Ooh.
If authentic, why did the shroud originally end up in Edessa and not Jerusalem or Rome?
That's a great question. Can I take it?
Sure.
All right.
Rome would have seemed a logical place, right? Jerusalem would have seemed a logical place, except of course, by the year 70, Jerusalem fell. And so we actually do have some historical evidence that there was something that was venerated in Antioch. And St. Athanasius of Alexandria mentions this in a homily in the year 327, where he speaks of an image of our Lord that was taken from Jerusalem to Antioch when that city fell, referring to the fall of Jerusalem. So I do think we could possibly make that connection. Again, it's something I've spoken about before, is the limitations of our vocabulary. We don't know specifically what he was mentioning, what this artifact was, but clearly something that was venerated, that was taken. So, but that's a great question. I think that's a fair one to ask.
Okay, great. This is a question specifically for Barry. So at the start of your research, Barry, what was your best guess as to what the shroud was? What was your starting point?
Well, I'm somewhat embarrassed to say that my initial opinion was we'll get to Turin, we'll find the paint and the brushstrokes and come home. So I didn't take it very seriously. And of course, it's 40 some years later and I'm still doing this. So obviously my opinion changed.
Okay. So you started off thinking medieval artwork and
I wasn't even sure it would be medieval, to be honest. I just thought, yeah, it's just a painting. And of course, it took about 10 to 15 minutes after the shroud was exposed to us. And, you know, we photographers always carry around a 10x magnifying loupe in our pockets. And so I immediately, as soon as the shroud was unveiled, started looking at the image, looking for paint, for brushstrokes, for binders, something that would imply an artwork. And within 10 or 15 minutes of looking at the image, all I could see were slightly more discolored yellowed fibers in the image area than in the non-image areas. And so probably within that first 15 minutes, my painting theory went out the window.
Well, Father Spitzer, I think these might be yours or maybe Barry. A couple questions about alternative explanations, right? So well, let's ask it this way. What is the most compelling hypothesis concerning the shroud that does not favor its authenticity?
That does not validate its authenticity. I haven't, there's no compelling explanation of the shroud that doesn't include radiation or mechanical transparency. I agree with John Jackson. So by definition, I wouldn't find anything compelling that couldn't explain those two features. And if it's got those two features, then it has a component of authenticity, because you're talking about a very, as John Jackson put it conservatively, this is a very unconventional, heretofore unknown physical source, or it's transphysical, it's supernatural. And so that kind of bodes for its authenticity. So, I have not found anything, if somebody says, oh, paint's the answer, or, scorching is the answer, or whatever is the answer, if it doesn't include radiation and mechanical transparency, it's not compelling. I mean, I think John Jackson has done that in a very compelling way.
I have a thought on that.
Sure.
Is that well, I don't have any idea what caused the image. It could very well be radiation. But to answer that question about whether compelling theories that would suggest it is not authentic, then you have to go to the either or proposition, which is really, really important. And that is this: either the Shroud of Turin is the authentic burial shroud of Jesus, or it's not. And if it's not, then what is it? If it's not authentic, it has to be the result of human effort, either as an artwork or as some kind of a deliberate fraud of some kind, right? So you're ostensibly looking for something that was produced in the 1400s. In the 14th century, perhaps circa 1350 or so. And so you have to look at who the most notable artists were at that time. And Walter McCrone says it could be Simone Martini. Gary Viken says it could be Nato Ceccarelli. So when you look at the artwork of those two particular artists, you realize that there's nothing that they have done that even remotely compares with the shroud, even remotely. And so how do you just make this glib allegation that, well, it must have been done by Simone Martini, when nothing that he did even compares with the shroud? So when you look at this hypothesis that it's the result of human effort, who is he? He's not identified. We don't know how he did it. We don't know what substances he used. There's no identified process that was used. This is the problem when you allege that if it's not authentic, what's the alternative?
Right. I want to add just one tiny thing to what Russ just said, is that I've always been a little bit baffled by the 14th century hypothesis myself, because how does an artist in the 14th century, being a medievalist, this is something I was particularly interested in. How does an artist in the 14th century produce an artwork they can't see? Because remember, the complexity of the image is not known to us until photography. It's the advent of photography that made the complexity of the image known, and that didn't happen until 1898. So to not be able to see the complexity of what the artist has created, to me, rules out anything medieval, anything contrived, anything human done in the Middle Ages.
I'd
And
like
add
to,
oh.
I'd like to chime in quickly if I could.
Sure.
Look, the STRP team considered all of the theories proposed mostly by skeptics back in the 70s. It's a painting, it's a scorch, it's a photograph. And our science literally proved, and you won't hear me use that word very often, or Ray Rogers will come out of the grave and smack me upside the head. But we proved that it's not a painting and it's not a scorch and it's not a photograph. And those were the predominant theories of the day. And it still makes me laugh when I hear skeptics echoing those same theories over and over again when the peer-reviewed science shows it's not any of those things.
And furthermore, just with respect to Cheryl's hypothesis too, I mean, you've got the blood imprints were on the shroud before the image.
Yeah.
You tell me how a medieval forger can get the anatomical positioning correct for, I believe it's 370 bloodstains, can get those positioned absolutely correctly on that shroud and then overlay the image on top of it, not having the image there to put the bloodstains on.
Right.
I mean, unbelievably unbelievable. That's all.
But to your point, I mean, there's no image under the blood. Hence, that means the blood had to be on the cloth first, followed by the image.
You can
That's what I'm
tell,
saying.
yeah, absolutely. You can tell because, when you look at, let's suppose that particle radiation or some other source created the friability of the cloth. That's the crumbly nature, the fragile nature of the uppermost surface of the fibrils that's causing the image to be there. You can detect friability underneath the bloodstain or not underneath the bloodstain. It's not underneath the bloodstain. The whatever source of radiation got to that cloth, it didn't get there before the bloodstain, and that really does put into question the hypothesis that a medieval forger did it.
Okay, thank you. This related to the science question again. Why was the information about the carbon dating not made available until I'll assess that? How was it not made available?
That's an ethics
fully?
And
question more
everyone
than a
laughs. It is
science
an ethics
question.
question. It's definitely an
Well,
ethics
you kind of have to back into your 95% confidence. So you eliminate all the outlying data until you can get there, right? I mean, that's called fudging the data, and that's what they did. So when you willfully don't publish all of your data, it seems to me you're hiding something. And so, I mean, that's all I can assume. I mean, it's there may be another explanation, but that's all I can assume from that.
Well, Russ, tell us how you really feel.
So true, so true.
Okay, I guess that's the answer.
Yeah, I concur. I don't want to say anybody was dishonest, but
Yes, yeah, it is an ethics question. I think that's the best way to answer it.
Well, if I tell how I really feel, I'd have to repent. So I
Oh,
You got one sitting right next to you.
Father, I have sinned.
that's right.
If I could chime in.
Right, that's right.
But Barry's saying something.
Yeah,
Barry,
if
go
I
ahead.
could quickly chime in, and I don't want to get too controversial here, but on that topic, understand that the gentleman from the British Museum, who was the overseer of the 3 laboratories and the holder of all the data out at the end of the process, I found it interesting that as soon as the carbon dating results were released, the Oxford laboratory received £1 million sterling anonymous contribution, and the gentleman from the British Museum left the British Museum and took a permanent chair at Oxford.
There
Just
you go.
saying. Just saying.
Yeah.
So are you saying, Barry, that you should follow the money?
Oh, you just said that, Russ.
All right. Well, how about we talk about the Bible? Let's do
Let's
that.
talk
Yeah.
about the
So, why, if it's a bit of a theological question or interpretation, really. So, assuming Christ's body was transported without removing the shroud, why was the stone rolled away?
Well, there's two possible answers to it from a non-theological point of view. This would be more or less a scientific point of view. If you take the nuclear disintegration process, even though it's a low temperature process, it could give rise to a sonic boom that would be fairly substantial, a very bright light as well, that would be low temperature, non-destructive of the cloth. So you might have, I mean, Kitty Little actually postulated that, that she thought it, maybe there was a sound, a boom that may have, blown something back or without destroying the cloth itself. So that's one possible explanation. But from a theological point of view, why would the stone be rolled back? Because God can do anything he wants. And if he can raise a body from the dead, he can roll back a stone.
Well, I thought from the scripture tells you that it was an angel who rolled the stone back, and then and that was specifically to reveal the empty tomb. And you remember the story where Mary's the first one there, and then Jesus, disguised as the gardener, says, why do you seek the living among the dead? And so the stone had to be rolled back in order to demonstrate that he's not here, he has risen. And so I mean, that's my view. Blame it on the angels.
Which means ultimately blame it on God.
Well, I've got nowhere to go from there. So
Well, back to a science question. Would anyone speak to the botanical materials found on the shroud?
Well, I'm not a botanical person, but I can tell you probably why the image of those flowers and things are there. And I can just speak a little bit to the pollen grains, but with respect to the flowers and things of that nature, people have said, well, those were lying on the exterior of the body. How would it be possible for them to be emblazoned on the shroud? And the answer is, remember those heavy charged particles. If one of those deuterons or one of those protons hits an iron nucleus in one of the flowers, and right, a lot of iron in flowers, you can imagine that it's if a neutron hits, one of those nuclei, it'll give off a heavy charged particle, and it'll embed itself right into the cloth. You can actually see the image of those heavy charged particles, again, embedding themselves right on the uppermost surface of the fibrils, because they're absorbing a neutron from the disintegrating body, and they're freeing off a heavy charged particle to embed itself in the shroud. By the way, if there are coin imprints on there, and the jury is out on this, right? I mean, I know a very good friend of Barry's, Don Lind, is against it because of the coarseness of the grain on the cloth. But we don't know everything about particle radiation, and we don't know, how it might have the ability through, again, neutron penetration of the coin, in this case, it would hit a copper nucleus and give rise to a heavy charged particle, what kind of an impression it would make. Certainly, it would give rise to some of the shape of the coin, which we do see there, and we can tell the diameter of it. But whether it gives rise to the images, jury's out. But the point I'm trying to get to is that's a possible way of having these external things embed themselves on the shroud. With respect to the pollen, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to clarify, just so people understand, with regard to flower images, under certain kinds of contrast photography, you can see certain flower images, chrysanthemum and some other, there's some other flower images, and some actually correlate with pollen that's on the shroud as well. So if you're saying, where's the flowers? I never saw any flowers. It's because it shows up in certain kinds of contrast photography. And then with regard to the coins, we're talking about coins over the eyes, that may be a Roman lepton printed, minted 29 to 33 AD, with some lettering on it that corresponds to that coin. The only problem is that it doesn't show up in all photography. It only shows up, if it even shows up, in 1931 photography. So most, it might be there, maybe it's not there. So I agree with you. The form of it appears to be there, but I think that's all we can say about it.
Yeah, the form does have the same diameter within, small variations of a Roman lepton.
It'd be nice if it was there.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, with respect to the pollen, just too, if that's what people were getting at, there are a variety of pollens that are embedded in the cloth that show the journey that Russ described. You basically have identified by Max Frey, and then later by other botanists as well, additional pollen fibers, but 14 of them are indigenous to the realm of northern Judea and Jerusalem, and part of I think that 7 of them are found only in that region of northern Judea. So that's a pretty good indication that it was in Jerusalem in the open air for a fairly long period of time. Could a medieval forger have procured all of those indigenous pollen grains from Jerusalem and northern Judea? It's on the realm of the ridiculous, but no, not really. I just don't think that's in the realm of possibility. Again, we see that there are 3 indigenous pollen grains that are from the area of Edessa. That's where Russ was talking about. That was the place in Turkey where the Mendelian, or the holy image, was said to be, and he has very good evidence of that, because the Roman emperor who came down there, he not only did pay for it and did give prisoners, but he laid siege to the city for a while, which of course made history. And the reason for that was to get the shroud, the holy image.
Right.
But the main thing that's there is that's the city where we've got those 3 unique pollen. We have other pollen fibers that could be from that area. 3 definitely that could have only really come from that area. And I believe we have 2 from Constantinople, 2 or 1, depending on who you listen to, from Constantinople. So we can tell just by the pollen fossils that, that what Russ said, going from Jerusalem up to the Mendelian and the changing of the iconography in Edessa, all the way up to the domain of Constantinople, where Robert de Clary, has that significant testimony to seeing the whole thing unfurled. That's confirmed by the pollen fossils and the pollen grains.
I think this kind of question just underscores why this is the most studied artifact in history, is because we see all these different disciplines that are able to come together, that have been brought to bear on the same 14-foot strip of linen, and how each discipline complements each other. As a historian, I've always been struck by the environmental journey that the shroud has taken based on its pollen evidence, that I couldn't necessarily fill in with the historical record, but I can tell you that it was in this place. We just don't know when. So underscores the need for our continued interdisciplinary, and not only that, but the continued questions that are going to come forth. We're never going to get to a point, I don't think, where we won't have questions.
I like the fact that it's covered with limestone particles.
Yes, the travertine aragonite.
Specific pine limestone that is specific to the hills and tombs around Jerusalem.
Right.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Indeed.
So,
and then the comparison to, if you're going to plant evidence and you look at, the Sudarium of Oviedo, which has a provenance going back to 616, and really some bishops of unquestionable reputation who just, placed it in 718 in Oviedo, Spain. Well, you have 120 points of congruence
Right.
between the face cloth of Oviedo, which has no image, just bloodstains. You have 70 points of congruence on the front of that, the front of the shroud and the front of the face cloth, and you have 50 points of congruence on the back, all the way down to the nape of the neck, all the way across the top of the head. Are you kidding me? Do you know the odds of producing those 120 points of congruence by just pure chance without those two cloths touching the same face? Astronomically high against it. So the idea is, if they did touch the same face, isn't it interesting to note that the same indigenous pollen grains that are there on the shroud are also there on the face cloth of Oviedo from the Jerusalem and northern Judea area. Now, of course, they take slightly different routes after they leave Jerusalem, because they might have left at different periods. But one thing is for sure, that by 616 AD, we have a specific provenance for the face cloth of Oviedo. How are you going to explain this with that carbon dating?
I just explained that the sudarium is a small towel. It's like 20 by 30 inches. And this is the napkin that was in the tomb in John's gospel, which I skipped over. I didn't mention because it leads to another lecture.
It is a whole other lecture.
And but presumably this cloth was wrapped around the face of Jesus after he died. So you can imagine now Jesus has died, his face is covered with blood, got this crown of thorns, blood coming down, stuff coming out of his nose and his mouth, pleural fluid from the ordeal of crucifixion. And it would have been a tradition to cover the face of the dead. I can imagine one of the women going up to the centurion and saying, "May we cover his face?" And he would have said, "Yeah, go ahead and be quick about it." And so they put a little step stool up there, wrap his face with this cloth. This remains on his face, and so they get him to the side of the tomb. But then that is removed from his face, rolled up, placed next to the body. It would not have stayed on the face. It would be the only other cloth other than the linen shroud that would have been permitted to be on his face would have been the Jewish talit, or the prayer cloth, which was probably gambled away or stolen by the Romans. Remember, they cast lots for his garments. And so in this, again, as Father Spitzer said, there's no image on this cloth and on the sudarium, but it's covered with about 1 part blood and 6 parts pleural fluid, which is very interesting, because that's a sign of crucifixion. This is what people die of, is asphyxia, the inability to breathe. Your lungs fill up with pleural fluid, and that's exactly what we see. We see the effect of pleural effusion on this sudarium. This cloth was used in a crucifixion, and I think that's really significant.
Yeah, it was poured out too through the nose and the mouth, so very much significant.
I'd like to add something quickly here. Being Jewish and being more of an Old Testament guy than a New Testament guy, when I got involved with the Shroud and started doing my research, sort of knowledge, get more knowledge. When I read that passage in the Gospels about the second cloth folded and separate from the other, that immediately told me this was an authentic Jewish burial, because Jewish law requires that anything soaked with the blood of the decedent be buried with the body. And so the fact that it was kept in the tomb, folded and put separately, verifies to me that Jesus was given an authentic Jewish burial. Otherwise, that wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
Good point.
Let's make Brian work here. Brian, what will happen to the exhibition after July 30th?
Well, at the moment, we don't have anything fixed yet, but we're working something out. A couple of the elements of the exhibition, the touch table with the sensors that play the gospel passages and all, that we're working out a way in which it can go on display at the Funerary Museum in Houston, Texas. And they may be interested as well in some of the other technology that we developed for it. So that's kind of in an immediate timeframe after the exhibition is concluded. And then we had conversations that began yesterday about the possibility of having this exhibition recreated someplace, I don't know, someplace near Father Spitzer.
Yeah.
We will see about that. Right now, it's still in the talking phase. We haven't worked out all the details.
That's not what I heard, Brian.
So
I heard that this exhibit is going to be so popular that you're going to keep it as a permanent exhibit. That's what I heard.
We should have such a problem.
So I'm going to open the bidding at. It's a cool exhibit. It's worth it. All right. We are coming up on time, and we have a special guest that we'd like to give an opportunity to share with us a bit. So let me ask one last quick question. As we are approaching Lent and the season of Easter, how would you recommend we approach the shroud and the image of the shroud?
I really think that it is, and I think I'm going to borrow an expression from Barry Schwartz here, who talks about it being a perfect icon. Is that not right, Barry? You've used that expression before? A
Yeah, I think
perfect
I have.
icon. And I think that regardless of where one is in a faith journey or not, to be able to contemplate the shroud, to be able to contemplate the wounds of this man that's in the shroud in a real way, and to just contemplate the meaning of the suffering. I think that ultimately we're all drawn to the question about anything we encounter in our life. The question is always, what does this mean? And that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think too, just to add to what Cheryl said, I think this is a great relic for Holy Week, for sure. And even as a preparation for Holy Week, there are many things that I did not talk about. The blunt force trauma, that would have happened, if he fell, which is so manifest on the shroud, that this big, cross beam is just pounding when he falls. It pounds him so hard on the back, it, twists his neck to the left and just forces his right eye into its socket so deeply. I mean, you just see the pain, that he went through. You cannot in any way, you just have to have this deep sympathy for the Lord. And, as I said, I believe, and it's a mystery, but I believe this is the burial cloth of Jesus. And I look at the evidence there, and, the scraping on the knees and the traumas that he went through and the asphyxiation. It's just unbelievable. So anyway, I think it's great for Holy Week and a great preparation for Holy Week.
I like to look at the shroud as a demonstration of two things. It represents love and hope.
Yep.
Love, because you have the whole pattern of bloodstains, which correlates with what Jesus says, where he says, greater love has no man than he lay his life down for his friends. But then it's also hope, because it speaks to the hope of the resurrection, not his resurrection. He's already risen. I'm talking about our resurrection. And so, when you look at some of these experiments that have been done, like on UV lasers, a 40 nanosecond burst on a UV laser achieves the same depth and coloration as we see on the shroud. That's really cool stuff. And it correlates with 1 Corinthians 15, verse 51 and 52, where Paul is saying, behold, I show you a mystery. We will not all sleep. That means to remain dead, but we will all be changed. How? In the twinkling of an eye. He's talking, he's talking about a transformational future event in the future. Hasn't even happened yet. He's talking about our resurrection, but that's exactly what happened to Jesus in the tomb, because Jesus is called the first fruits of the resurrection. And so if he's the first fruit, that means we're the rest of the fruit that comes later at the end of the age. So it's love and hope. Love because God has manifested his love towards us through the crucifixion. But then it's hope. It's hope for our resurrection because he rose first.
Ditto.
Did.
Sounds like a place to end. So, yeah. So let's thank Brian, Cheryl, Russ, Father Spitzer, and Barry for their presentations. I would invite to the lectern the distinct honor of having His Excellency Archbishop Christophe Pierre, the Apostolic Nuncio here in Washington, D.C., to address us this afternoon. Please welcome His Excellency.
Good evening. In the program that you have, I read about Father Robert Spitzer. I greet you, Father. A question. Could it be Jesus? Could it be Jesus? Could it be Jesus? You know, I remember when I was young, I heard about Jesus from my parents. My father, my mothers, they were believers in Jesus. I knew Jesus because of their witness, because of the kind of education they gave me, which has always something to do with Jesus. So it created in my heart a profound desire to know Jesus. I remember when I was at primary school, it was in Madagascar, because my family lived in Madagascar. Have you heard about Madagascar? In the primary school, there was a brother. Mary's brother was our teacher. He was a Malgache, by the way. And at the end of a class of religion, he showed us this image. And he told me, you know, at the end of the school, he said, look, this is the true face of Jesus. You know, I was so happy. I was maybe 8 years old. And I took the image. I want to keep it. And the brother said, no, it's mine. So I had to give back the image of Jesus to the brother. But I went home so happy because I had seen the true face of Jesus. My whole life has been a search for the true face of Jesus. And may I say, you know, this has been an encounter with a person. It's interesting. I heard only the end of your presentations, but the end was magnificent. You applauded it. You know, this concentration of a piece of linen, which has occupied so many people, and the amount of research, the amount of intelligence, which shows that we are an intelligent people, intelligent race. The human race is intelligent. And with this, the perseverance, the determination to know more and more about what is there, it's interesting. And at the end of it, all these people who are scientific, you know, historians, researchers, you know, I don't understand half of what Father Spitzer told us. You know, to be honest with you, you know, the carbon number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But anyway, doesn't matter because it's fascinating. You know, when you don't know science and you hear scientifics, you are always fascinating because you did. I wish I was able to say, to know, and maybe one day, but I'll be too old for that. You know. So, but, you know, at the end of it, these people, they tell us that they have seen Jesus. But because what they talk about is, by the way, the disapparition of Jesus. And Jesus who was there, and he's not there, but he's still there. Because he's risen from the dead. So what a mystery. You know, you said mystery and faith. Here we are, mystery and faith. This is the mystery of the incarnation of the Lord. And incarnation, what does it mean? It means precisely that. It means that God was made man, became human, died, suffered. And we have a witness of that. But he's also risen from the dead, so he's not there anymore. You know, the first disciples who had seen Jesus touch him, lived with him, at the end of the process, were not with them. You know, the pilgrims, the two disciples of Emmaus, they were sad. But they met him again when they shared with them bread and when he disappeared, because he was risen from the dead. So if we are able to do what they have done, and if we are able to contemplate, because I heard that word, contemplation, you know, contemplate this piece of linen with the eyes of faith, it is precisely because he was there, but he's not there anymore. But he's still there with us. Thank you.
Thank you.